Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto went through puberty again. Our heroes did not come from a future where everything has gone horribly wrong. They did not travel back in time to save the world from a bleak or miserable fate. As a matter of fact, all they want to do is find a way back home as soon as possible. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 31, Meetings and Greetings. Hokage's Office. Timeline Beta. The Past. Hello, Danzo. I understand you wanted to meet with me. The Sandaime sat at his desk, hands folded in front of him, smiling and projecting a disarmingly kind and grandfatherly air. His old friend was not fooled one whit by this geniality, however, but then Danzo was not terribly open or emotional to begin with. I did indeed, said the former commander of Root in a gruff, unamused tone. As a matter of fact, I seem to recall making an appointment a week before the final phase of the exams. Curious how the request has only now been processed, a week after the final phase. He gave Hiruzen a pointed look and tapped his cane on the floor as if to punctuate his statement. It has been a very busy couple of weeks, said Hiruzen, shrugging. Both the incident with that party, then those new facts that were brought to light regarding young Itachi's case and the subsequent hearing, as well as organizing mandatory psychiatric exams for all shinobi above a certain rank, and of course the exam itself. I understand you haven't finalized your decision on the exam results, Danzo said evenly. He leaned on his cane and swept an eye over the Sandaime's table. It was nearly devoid of paperwork, a mark of Hiruzen's diligence and skillful time management. When will you announce the new promotions? When I've made my final decision, Hiruzen smartly replied. Foolish choices are often made in haste, but a little patience and thought can avert them entirely. Mulling too long over the same dilemma will send your mind into endless circles, however, Danzo shot back. Resolve yourself to act, or ruminate forever. Some things never change. You are as impatient as ever, Danzo. And I see that you are still an indecisive panderer, Hiruzen. The Sandaime chortled. Did you make this appointment 2 weeks in advance merely to lecture me on timely action? I expected it to take no more than a day for my request to be processed, Danzo said. Considering my position. You are retired, Danzo. Officially, you have no position. Danzo glowered at the third, narrowing his one visible eye. With a harumph he once more impatiently rapped his cane on the floor. His expression was stony and unreadable. What have you decided in regards to Kakashi's cell? He brusquely inquired. His students are certainly fit to become Chunin, Hiruzen said, stroking his beard. They have all demonstrated the necessary leadership skills in some form or other, and of course their strength is unprecedented. That is not what I meant, and you know it, Danzo muttered. Ah. Is this a matter of how quickly Naruto's abilities have grown, then? Hiruzen ventured a guess. Do you and the council fear that the Nine Tails might be subverting the boy and teaching him skills too advanced for him to be trusted with? Or that he is simply growing too strong, and poses a threat of some kind? Danzo gave Hiruzen an odd look. Why should I be concerned about that? He asked. Certainly the sheer level of the boy's mastery over the fox's chakra is surprising, and I do think precautions should be taken to ensure that he does not turn against the leaf, but if anything, I had until recently feared that the boy would turn out too weak to be of use to the village. So as long as his power is put to a constructive use. Indeed, Hiruzen hummed, affording his old friend a small, wry smile. Although I do believe that our definitions of constructive use vary wildly. Humph. Undoubtedly, Danzo muttered with a dark scowl. But if nothing else, the power he displayed at the exams should serve as a deterrent against our enemies. And even if you are too soft-hearted to train the boy as he ought to be, surely you can at least appreciate the fact that the very knowledge of his existence as a Jinchuriki is an invaluable psychological weapon. Yes, fair enough, Hiruzen said. A fearsome reputation will deter all but the strongest and boldest, allowing us to spare ourselves from many a needless conflict. Such was the case with the boy's father, and with the Uchiha clan as well, to a degree. Danzo's expression soured. And so you touch on the heart of my concerns, he said. The Nine-Tails Jinchuriki is impressionable and simple-minded, such that he should be easy to keep in line, but his teammate is another matter entirely. Oh, not this again, Hiruzen couldn't help but groan. You and your damn obsession. Yes, this again, Danzo responded. I will not back down. The Uchiha should not be trusted. Really now, will you never stop? Hiruzen shook his head and reached into his desk, bringing up a handful of papers to straighten and shuffle. Do you have some manner of personal vendetta against the clan? I should have thought your crusade was over, with all but 2 of them dead. But the 2 who remain are by themselves a greater threat than the whole rest of their clan had been, Danzo said. If they were to turn on the village. Or if you or I were to turn on the village, Hiruzen said, or Jiraiya, or Kakashi, or Guy, or the Umbu or any number of our elite shinobi. Yes, Itachi and Sasuke are dangerous. But making a fuss over it is nonsense when there are so many other dangerous people in Konoha. You know they're unpredictable, Danzo said, continuing unabated. The Uchiha have a long history of. They're determined, Hiruzen interjected, cutting the other man off. And Itachi has proven himself loyal beyond any shadow of doubt, as you should well know. Danzo glowered. Spare it, Hiruzen. Your sentimentality will be the death of me. Don't lie, old friend, Hiruzen said with a smirk. If you were that easy to kill, many of my problems could have been solved by now. And if I could, I would have killed you long ago, Danzo drawled. So we are left at an impasse and forced into damnable compromise. Hiruzen set the papers down on the desk and reached for his pipe. It was unlit, and he tapped a bit of tobacco into it. Then he pressed his thumb to the base and channeled a bit of fire-natured chakra through it, sending a thin wisp of smoke into the air. By the way, Danzo, he said slowly, eyeing his old friend. I've been meaning to ask, but weren't you scheduled to attend a remedial ethics class today? Danzo averted his gaze, a slightly guilty expression on his face. Ah, well. He mumbled evasively. I thought so, Hiruzen said, smiling. I'll let you off this time, but your teacher might not be so forgiving. The visible portion of Danzo's face reddened. Because simply saying Danzo blushed would have felt much too surreal. Ichiraku Ramen. Timeline Gamma. The future. Nervous breakdowns caused by overwork. That was the official explanation Shikamaru and the others had composed. It was terse, but a believable fabrication. The Hokage in particular was well known to be very diligent in his duties, and many had expected that something like this would happen eventually, and his wife was likewise dedicated to her own job. Similarly, Sakura Uchiha had been known to work herself to the point of exhaustion, and her husband was, well, Sasuke. Something like a nervous breakdown sounded entirely possible, if it was them. That was not, of course, the actual case. But this whole time travel fiasco was, for various reasons, hushed up and kept on the down low by Shikamaru and the others. Pretty much only Boruto, Sarada, the people who attended the emergency meeting, and a few others were in on the truth. Things could get very complicated very quickly if people found out exactly why Lord Seventh and 2 of the most reliable people in the village, plus Sasuke, were taking an indefinite leave of absence from their duties, so it was necessary to devise a cover story. Likewise, it was necessary for the 12-year-old versions of Naruto, Sasuke, Sakura, and Hinata to get briefed on various matters. Organizing everything the kids would need to be told, however, would take a while, and until then Umbu were keeping close eyes on them to make sure they didn't get into too much trouble. Accepting this was the major condition for them to be allowed into the village at large. So, the odds of them causing any serious problems were low. Hence why Naruto was allowed to be sitting on his favorite stool at Ichiraku, slurping up a bowl of ramen with unassailable cheer. 2 empty bowls were already sitting on the table before him. Suspended from the ceiling in one corner, an LCD television was broadcasting a news report on economic trends and predictions that Naruto found utterly incomprehensible and thus completely ignored. Greedily, the blonde tipped back his third bowl of ramen and downed the broth in a single draft. "Ma-on, that really hits the spot," he said, setting the now empty vessel down on the stack and letting out a contented sigh. "One more, Bachin." Ayame, middle-aged and happily married, couldn't help but twitch a little at this form of address. It was uncharacteristic of the Lord Seventh, who usually just called her Ayame, and reminded her of how he used to be as a kid and young adult before finally taking the effort to learn proper manners and courtesy while dating Hinata. She'd never quite grasped how irritating that side of him could have been until today. It was one thing to be called Neshin, that was cute and kind of endearing, but Bachin, well, Ayame was hardly the most vain woman around, but she was still young enough to feel a little annoyed at being called something like that. Especially by a man who wasn't even more than 5 or 6 years her junior. So it was with a moderately forced smile and a subtly pulsing vein in her forehead that Ayame set a fourth bowl of ramen on the table before her customer. "Here you are, Hokage-sama," she said through grit teeth, visibly biting back her annoyance. "Enjoy." If Naruto noticed her irritation, he didn't show any sign of it. Considering who this was, particularly in terms of his mental age at present, it was not at all surprising. He had zero ability to read the atmosphere. Ayame headed into the back to attend the pots and strainers and such, and Naruto attacked his ramen with relish. A few minutes into his fourth bowl, the curtain behind the blonde parted. Hayashi Hyuga walked into Ichiraku Ramen. It was like the setup to a joke, except for the grimly serious look on his face. Although Hayashi almost always looked like that anyways. But he stepped into the restaurant and took a seat beside Naruto as though he had intended to from the start. That very well may have been the case, too. Muttering a low but polite greeting to Ayame, Hayashi quietly requested a bowl of shio ramen and 2 cups of sake. Ayame huffed at this, considering it was the middle of the day and all that, as well as the fact that she didn't technically have a liquor license, but Hayashi waved away her complaints and produced a ryo bill of relatively high denomination. "Keep the change," he said, and Ayame quickly changed her tune. Outwardly, at least. She still shot Hayashi a mildly disapproving look when she didn't think he was looking. He saw this, of course, but accepted it with grace and no complaint. It was honestly rather inappropriate, after all, for a man of his standing to be seen drinking in the middle of the day. Naruto, finishing up his fourth bowl, finally noticed Hayashi's presence. "Oh," he said, blinking owlishly. Seeing Hayashi give him a piercing look, he sheepishly added, hi." Ayame came back with a bottle of shaku and 2 cups. "It's all we have," she said. Her tone was polite, if only grudgingly so. "Thank you," Hayashi said with a nod. "I'll have another shasha ramen, please." Naruto interjected, stacking up his fourth empty bowl. "Of course," said Ayame, a little glad that he hadn't called her Bachin this time. She then turned and walked once more into the back of the shop. A moment of silence passed. Naruto fiddled with his chopsticks and stared off into space. At the same time, Hayashi silently uncapped the bottle and poured out 2 glasses of shaku. The older man had a calm expression on his face, neutral and nearly unreadable. He pushed 1 glass toward Naruto. "Here, son," he said, catching the blonde's attention. "Let's talk." Naruto blinked. Warning signs began to go off in his head. Go ahead, drink up," Hayashi said, gesturing vaguely. "This is the kind of discussion that I would rather not have sober." He then took a sip from his glass, saying this, and nodded to his son-in-law. Naruto had no idea who this old guy was or what he wanted with him. But hesitantly, feeling those oddly familiar eyes on him, Naruto raised his own cup and took an anxious, tentative sip. He then immediately spewed it back out, making a face and gagging. "Gah! That's bitter!" he exclaimed. A soft chortle came from Hayashi, seeing this reaction. The man nodded, his lips quirking up at the corners. "So are many trappings of adulthood," he said wistfully, taking another sip. "But we must learn to accept the good and the bad. And sometimes you may find that something which seems initially unpleasant might actually become enjoyable, if you simply endure it a little while." Naruto knitted his brows and shot a skeptical look at this strange, unfamiliar old man. But, reluctantly, he tried taking another sip of shaku. He downed it quickly, like forcing medicine down his throat, and shuddered as he set the glass back down. "Still tastes awful," he grunted, making a face. Hayashi laughed. An actual laugh, however soft and understated. Even not having any idea who this guy was, aside from an oddly visceral mixture of apprehension and foggy familiarity somewhere in the back of his mind, Naruto had a feeling that this was something remarkable. Just looking at the way this man carried himself could betray that much. Yes, it does, Hayashi agreed. But this is the traditional way for men to have a heart-to-heart talk, wouldn't you agree? Naruto frowned and cocked his head. I wouldn't know, old-timer. Hayashi looked at him thoughtfully for a moment. Then he smiled, a small and bittersweet thing, before taking yet another sip. Perhaps, he murmured. But we have to try and understand each other before we can try to change each other. You taught me at least that much, son. Naruto sat quietly on his stool, and reluctantly took another sip from his glass. He said nothing. Hinata was in a fretful state when I saw her earlier today, Hayashi continued after a brief silence. It seems you did something to upset her. It took Naruto a second to remember who Hinata was, and another second or two to figure out what Hayashi might be talking about. He blushed, recalling how he had woken up in bed with a woman who was apparently the grown-up version of that strange, dark, quiet girl from his class at the academy. Considering the relatively lacking state of dress in which the two of them had awoken, it was not inconceivable that she might be angry or dismayed with him. Girls didn't like to be seen naked, or at least that was the impression he'd gotten in the past, and they also didn't seem to like to see most boys naked. And the two of them, in that bed, had only been a couple garments each from lying there in their birthday suits. Of course she would be upset. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about, Naruto said, sighing. He felt an uncharacteristic pang of melancholy, and took another sip of shaku. The taste didn't seem quite as strong this time. Hayashi slowly nodded, giving Naruto a look that seemed almost sympathetic. I'm sure you didn't mean to hurt her, he said. At the very least she seems to think as much, even if it still upset her. I can't claim to understand all the intricacies of your relationship. Things are very different from how they were when I was young, or so it seems. But the fact remains that you made a mistake, and my daughter got hurt as a result. Naruto flinched. He looked intently at the surface of the bar. Ayame was frozen a little ways away, 2 bowls of ramen in hand, appearing hesitant to interrupt this discussion. She watched intently, abashed but undeniably interested. Sorry, Naruto mumbled. This felt like the only right thing to say. Don't apologize to me, Hayashi replied. I'm not the one who needs to hear it. Naruto winced, and he fidgeted uncomfortably. Hayashi's expression softened a hair, seeing this. You're a good man, Naruto. I know you are, he said. No other single person has done more for my family, for my daughter, than you have. I respect you, as both a shinobi and a human being. I know you'll do your best to make up for this, because you always have in the past. That is the only reason I've not already made an attempt on your life for upsetting her. Naruto gulped, his throat going dry. He took another sip and felt the alcohol burn all the way down to his stomach. She's my wife, he said half to himself, only now really grasping this. It seemed so bizarre. How did the two of us ever wind up together, anyway? He wondered aloud. I've often asked myself the same question, but love rarely makes sense from an outside perspective, Hayashi said. My daughter has cared for you since the beginning, and if I did not believe that you felt the same way for her. He gave Naruto a look and trailed off meaningfully. Naruto gulped. I really love her, he said to himself. His face reddened, his mind once more finding itself rudely invaded by the remembered sights of Hinata's very adult body lying on top of him, and in the bed next to him. I wonder why. Hayashi gave Naruto a curious look. That's a question only you can answer, he said evenly. If you don't know it by now, there's nothing I can tell you. Well, she did look real pretty in that nightgown. Naruto mumbled absently, scratching the back of his head. Hayashi sputtered, and his face went beet red. Too much information. He squeaked, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Naruto didn't seem to notice. Crescent Moon Kingdom. Timeline Beta. The past. It was a gorgeous day. Waves lapped at the beach, wetting the ivory sands. The sea was sparkling, its water crystal clear in the idyllic shallows of this private stretch of shore. Palm trees swayed in a gentle breeze, perfectly landscaped grass draping over the curve of a slowly rising hill. A path paved with planks of wood split the face of the hillside in two, rising up to the heel of a tropical seaside shack. Part of it was propped up on stilts and wood braces, an open balcony overlooking a sheer drop in a chain of tidal pools below. Overall, the structure had in its style of architecture that certain affectation of humility you might find in a wealthy man's retreat, and the quality of the construction was tellingly high. Considering where this was, the building was quite inconspicuous. Many rich merchants or what have you owned homes or timeshares on the shores of the Crescent Moon Kingdom, where property was coveted and highly valued, practically a status symbol. This place was further off the beaten path than most, located on the very edge of this small island country, but not so far from civilization as to be suspicious. It was perfectly innocuous. No one would suspect the true identity of the owner and inhabitant of this particular plot of land. Had Obito not been familiar with the man's chakra, even he might not have noticed it at all. But he was, and he did. Adjusting his swirly orange mask to make sure that the seal markings were properly aligned, a suppressing formula that cut off his eyes linked to whatever it was that had been showing him all that porn and naked Anko, Obito stepped out of his Kamui dimension, a manga Kyoshiri non-drilling though space-time and pulling his body through the hole like water through a drain. It was disorienting as hell and not just a little uncomfortable, but he was mostly used to it after all these years. The only factor really making it especially difficult now was the lingering soreness of Obito's body, and the awkwardness of getting used to a new arm and leg. But he grit his teeth and soldiered on with only a bare minimum of muttered swears and curses. Making sure that his cloak was on straight, Obito set his foot on the balcony overlooking the shallow pools. Down below he saw his quarry hunched over the water, poking and prodding something unidentifiable with various scientific instruments. Okay. He was locked on. Now came the hard part. Taking a deep breath and mentally bracing himself, Obito jumped down from the balcony in dramatic silence, cloak billowing impressively behind him. He landed feet first on one of the larger stones, crouching over his target like something out of a gothic novel. Obito took care to latch immediately onto the stone's surface with chakra, knowing that it would be smooth and likely slick, and bit back a hiss of pain at the concentrated ouch, which shot up his not quite completely mended yet legs. He knew from long experience what to watch out for when making a dramatic entrance. He had suffered more than enough pratfalls and failed theatrics in his youth to grasp the biggest risks of stunts like this, and so could usually pull something like this off with minimal difficulty. He had lots of practice. With one hand holding his mask in place, just in case, dramatically framing a shadowed hole as he lifted his dawn-colored vizard to let light stream through and glint off of a scarlet eye, Obito struck what he considered to be an appropriately intimidating pose. In live action it would have looked plain silly, but as a manga character he pulled it off with aplomb. The gesture was subtle and understated compared to the sort of grandstanding he'd enjoyed as a child, of course, but was it still an indulgence on Obito's part, catering to his personal lifelong fondness for theatrics? And it was honestly his firm belief, even after all these years, that whether one was a hero or a villain, knowing how to make an entrance was half the job. His inner child probably imagined a dramatic theme swelling with pomp and menace, maybe a slowly building orchestral piece that rose to a climax as the person below looked up from what they were doing to gaze on his masked face. Damn, I am so cool, the part of Obito that had never matured past the age of 13 was likely thinking at that moment. Hello. Orochimaru, he said in a deep and measured voice, his tone dripping with condescension. What brings an infamous devil like you so far from the shinobi territories? I'd heard you were a monster in human form, but look at you now. Reeking of low tide and poking at beached jellyfish. Orochimaru scoffed. For one thing, this is a culture of slime mold. Not a jellyfish. For another, it would be trapped in a tidal pool, not beached, he said scornfully, giving the masked man an unimpressed look. And I'm retired. What I do with my free time is my business and no one else's. A shame. Here I thought you might make a worthy partner in my endeavor. Obito muttered. But clearly you are just another weakling dragged along by the tides of history. Hardly an equal to Madara Uchiha. Orochimaru snorted. Please do drop the act, Obito-kun, he drawled, causing the man in the mask to visibly wince. Even if you were the real Madara, I have no interest in your little plot. My calling is something loftier. You just said that you were retired, though, Obito deadpanned, although he was still reeling from Orochimaru's casual name drop. From being a ninja, Orochimaru replied. I see no point in struggling to keep up with the younger generation as a fighter, not when the world holds so many mysteries for me to unravel. Better to spend my time doing research than risk humanity losing all of this uncatalogued knowledge. He tapped the side of his head, smirking. In a fight against some fresh, spry little monsters. I've been overtaken and roundly surpassed as a ninja, I'll readily admit that. There's clearly no future for me in war or politics, so it's far more constructive to just start over from scratch than try to salvage anything from my ill-conceived past experiments. He scooped a bit of the clear, gelatinous slime into a vial and capped it. I am a scientist, after all. I know better. A moment of silence passed. Are you sure you won't reconsider? Obito asked, his tone perhaps a touch imploring. Let's drop the pretenses. I wouldn't be approaching you if I had any other options. You are a creepy son of a bitch, and horribly untrustworthy, but I really don't have anyone else. Oh, yes, Orochimaru hummed. Nagato and Konan finally kicked you to the curb, I hear, and most of the other Akatsuki members have been killed or taken into custody. A pity. His voice was dripping with sarcasm on that last line. Obito twitched in response. You're alone, Orochimaru, he said slowly, precisely. You've cut yourself off from your support base and your underlings. And you aren't nearly as dangerous, by yourself, as Nagato and Konan were together. It's the same situation for you, Orochimaru smartly replied. Except that I chose to seclude myself, and am in peak condition, where you were ousted by your closest henchman and left for dead. And you still haven't healed completely, have you? A hand flashed up, holding a razor-sharp scalpel, and faster than Obito could react the blade scraped up the middle of his mask, raking a fine line through the hardened material. It was a perfectly straight, clean slice. Shallow and only scratching the surface, but the point was made. His body was still mending, even with the enhanced regeneration of Hashirama's cells, and his reflexes were yet only a shadow of what they should have been. Orochimaru had perfectly called his bluff. I really hate you, Obito muttered, raising a hand to the scratch. The spiral pattern of his visard was completely bisected. This was my favorite mask. The feeling is mutual, Orochimaru dryly quipped. So I suggest you go find someone else to team up with. I hear young Kabuto has taken over Otogakure in my absence. Humph. Maybe I will, Obito sniffed. Goodbye, and good riddance. Orochimaru coolly smiled. Jeeves, he said. Kindly escort our guest out. Of course, sir, said the elderly butler, standing on the rock next to the guest in question. Obito nearly jumped out of his skin at the man's sudden appearance. He hadn't even noticed the butler's presence. Here's the door, sir, Jeeves said, putting a hand on Obito's shoulder. And then, before Obito even knew what was happening, he was hurtling over the sea at a ridiculous speed with Orochimaru's last retreat rapidly shrinking into the distance. It took him a moment to piece together what had just happened, flying through the air like a human ragdoll. Of course Orochimaru wouldn't settle for an ordinary manservant. Note to self. Obito thought. Watch the hell out for butlers in the future. Konoha Market District. Timeline Gamma. The future. Hello. How are you doing today, Mrs. Uchiha? I hear you and your husband fell sick a while back. I hope you are on the mend. I saw your daughter in the market the other day, Mrs. Uchiha, and she looked so cute. She takes after her mother, that's for sure. Ah, Mrs. Uchiha. Here, have a free sample. We just got a fresh shipment of produce yesterday. The tomatoes are particularly juicy. Mrs. Uchiha. Mrs. Uchiha. Mrs. Uchiha. Sakura was walking on air as she went through the town, taking in her surroundings. A day had passed since they first arrived in this strange future, and despite the lethargy and fainting fits she had suffered from initially, the Pinkette now found herself feeling heartier and more vigorous than ever. According to the grown-up version of Ino, who'd wound up marrying some guy Sakura had never heard of, this was because of the pills they'd had her take. Supposedly it was some kind medicine intended to accelerate the growth of shrunken chakra reserves or something like that. Sakura didn't quite understand the specifics, as the details were all very technical and complicated even for an intelligent young thing like herself, but the gist of it was that she could now go out without having to worry about suddenly collapsing. Though apparently she'd been prone to such fits even before this whole time kerfuffle. But that didn't matter to Sakura. No, the important thing was that she, Sakura Harano, was Sasuke-kun's wife. It had been very surreal until now, and while she'd certainly reveled in the thought, it hadn't quite sunk in until she went out into town. Just seeing townspeople smile and wave, and hearing them greet her as Mrs. Uchiha, felt so marvelous that Sakura could barely contain herself. Only remembering what Shikamaru-san and the Lord Sixth had told her and the others about doing their best to avoid drawing attention to the fact that they were mentally 12 kept Sakura from jumping for joy or gaily skipping down the street. Still, she was smiling like crazy as she strolled through the market. She didn't have any particular business here, of course. It was just a pleasant break from the examinations and debriefings. As she walked downtown, humming cheerfully to herself, Sakura barely noticed as people's greetings became gradually cooler and more infrequent the further she traveled from the center of the village. Konoha's layout was quite different from what she remembered, and without paying close attention she could easily get herself lost. Every town had its underbelly. Even the most beautiful beach would have a shoal or stretch of shore where ocean currents and topographical oddities brought driftwood and refused to cluster together, garbage snagging more garbage until it had become an island of refuse in the corner of a sparkling sea. And while a lot of people who live on the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak, are just decent but down on their luck folk looking to eke out a living wherever they can, these places also tended to be overlooked, ignored, or avoided by authorities, such that less savory elements may also take root there. Konoha was a large, prosperous city. While petty crooks and gangs could not easily make a foothold in a village populated by shinobi, and the reputations of the 5 Kage and union elites tended to ward off the larger organizations and crime rings, the Hidden Leaf still had its own dark side. Social welfare and various programs kept most people clothed and fed, and unemployment rates were low with a good and strong economy, so it wasn't especially poor or run down, but there were still slums of a sort. Interestingly, the poorest and most lawless part of Konoha, again, relatively speaking, was located right where the old Uchiha district used to be. This was a place most people avoided due to ill rumors and bad reputation, an area haunted by the sins and hatred of past generations. Even in a ninja village, most people who had a choice would avoid living or developing in a place where so much bloodshed had occurred. Paradoxically appropriately, this plot of land was particularly attractive to social malcontents and troublemakers, whether otherwise honest folk who for one reason or another had grudges against the establishment, or bullies and wannabe thugs who saw it as a playground to run wild in. And considering the amount of text devoted to establishing all of this, it should be fairly obvious to the reader that Sakura just so happened to walk straight into this place. Even the brightest lad or lass could suffer a lapse in judgment when lost in romantic reverie, and Sakura was especially susceptible to bouts of daydreaming and giddy fantasization. So it's only a little surprising that, in her distraction, she might wander halfway across the village. It wasn't until the smiling faces and warm greetings had faded away and been completely replaced by haggard faces scowling and cloudy, drunken red eyes glaring that Sakura noticed it. When she became aware of the pinpricks of dozens of eyes boring holes into her form, she finally, belatedly snapped out of her dreamy daze and took a careful look at her surroundings. Naturally, she was perturbed to realize that she had no idea where she was. Furthermore, the glint and gleam of narrowed eyes and yellowing, gap-toothed sneers surrounded by the wafting reek of alcohol, vomit, and unwashed bodies left her distinctly nonplussed. Literally, for several seconds Sakura was left in a state where she could do nonplus. Or nothing more, to make it plainer. She was frozen up in a mixture of confusion, creeping unease, and a distinct sense that she was quite unwelcome here. Oi! How about ya get out, eh? Your kind ain't welcome here, woman. Slurred a hoary, jaundiced vagrant redundantly. Ar! Growled another, brandishing a half-empty bottle of cheap liquor. You Uchiha and your darn, Yukawa. Think you're so much better and rest of us. Go love. Jeered yet another, perversely dragging eyes up and down Sakura's form. Be a shame if and that purty arso yours got itself inter trouble with us any else, wouldn't it? Ho, now. Th's only thin I'd keep the witch round fur, personally another crowed. She's got a real nasty personality, but, body ain't too bad ter look at. Har har. Sakura's cheeks burned as she processed these words, and she shot indignant glares at the assembled drunks and wastrels. Although she was a little apprehensive to realize she had stumbled into a place like this, she did have her own pride as a kunoichi, and refused to show any sign that she might feel intimidated by a handful of bums. Sniffing, she turned her nose up at them before turning to leave, attempting to preserve her dignity and demonstrate her aloofness to their taunting while carrying out a tactical retreat. Humph. I don't have to stay here and listen to this, she muttered under her breath. Secretly, of course, as a 12-year-old youth in general and a historically insecure young girl in particular, Sakura was to some extent upset by these cries and sneers, but she refused to let it show. A proper young girl had to behave a certain way, after all. Guys didn't like girls who went around picking fights or shouting at the top of their lungs, did they? On the inside, of course, she ranted and raved angrily at these guys, but she did not say anything outwardly. Girls were supposed to be soft, sweet, and deferential. That was what boys liked, after all, wasn't it? Sighing, Sakura started to head back the way she came. She made it all of 3 steps before a grubby, sticky hand grabbed her by the arm. Oi, said we were done with ya, doll. Said one of the gaunt, sallow-faced wastrels. His fingers were long and bony, and his grip seemed terribly weak and clumsy to some unconscious part of Sakura, although a civilian might have found it strong and firm. Reeking breath burned her ears as he spoke, and she heard him lewdly smack his lips. I done blame ye for wanderin' away from treacherous eunuch. At a breakdown, dinny? Serves the dastard right, I say. Sakura shuddered and stiffened. What did you say, you bastard? Her inner self growled. Another vagrant shambled forward, short and hairy and enormously fat. Unlike Chuji, who wore his weight well and was suited to his hefty build by generations of adaptation and a lifetime of training, this man's face was glossy from a thick sheen of sweat even though it was a rather cool day out, and he was panting and noisily wheezing as he waddled over. Don't be rude to now, he said, smirking. I'm sure she loves husband dearly, I just came down, for a little fun and no more, I'm sure, ter laugh at us, hopeless trash and go back to, nice little, and nice little family. Not, fault she decided ter, itch up with a faithless piece o' scum like that Sasuke. Probably tricked, inter it with, is sherry non, hypnosis. Inner Sakura twitched. I think that was an insult, but I can't understand a word you assholes are saying, she drawled. Speak clearly or shut your ugly faces. I can't stand idiots. Please let go, she said aloud, trying to keep her tone cool and even. While she often lost her temper with the likes of Naruto and Ino, normally Sakura did try to be polite and respectful, at least on the surface. So even as much as the words of these guys irked and riled her, she did her best to bite back any retorts. That was the mature thing to do, wasn't it? A beat. The air of lurking menace completely dissipated, and suddenly the vagrants seemed completely harmless and cheerful. O' course, said the man who'd been grabbing her arm. But seriously, love, I'd suggest ye ter leave right soonish. There's lots of folk, who wouldn't take kindly ter your presence, and we wouldna want anythin' ter happen 'cause o' that. Sakura blinked, caught off balance by the sudden change. Huh. She said intelligently. Uchiha aren't all that welcome in this part of town, said another vagrant. Lots of people are still holding on to grudges from the war, and not everyone is so understanding of your husband's position, either. But we don't have anything against you personally. A third bum nodded enthusiastically, pointing helpfully down the street. Go on, miss. He said, beaming. We respect what you've done for mental and physical welfare of us citizens with your free clinics and all that, and Burke or not we're sure ye love your husband dearly. But there's some real rascals in these air parts as would not hesitate ter target yet, and we'd all rather not ave the old district topple on top our eads should one of them younger fools try summit on yet, I. Sakura stared olishly. Okay. She said, completely lost. Sure. Helpfully, the kind hobos proceeded to show her the way back into town, casually making various odd remarks about Sasuke and the Uchiha clan. Sakura was still a little perturbed, and she wondered what they meant by all that talk. It was terribly strange. It really was. Their accents were terribly strange. Chapter 32, Clash in the Stone of the Crescent Moon. Hokage's Office. Timeline Beta. The Past. Officially, in their own time, Naruto Uzumaki and Sasuke Uchiha were ranked as Hokage and Nukenin. One was the leader of the village, and the other was an unranked operative who worked outside the system to take care of things. Without a doubt, they were the two strongest and most respected shinobi alive. But neither of them had ever passed the Chunin exam, or been given a field promotion. Naruto was still just a genin. Sasuke didn't even have that much. They were not Chunin, not Jonin, not Umbu. Sasuke was technically classified as a rogue ninja, even if he had no bounty on his head and was perfectly loyal to his village, and willfully a subordinate of the Lord Hokage. Naruto, despite being the hero of the Fourth Great Ninja War and widely considered to have surpassed all the previous Hokage, was at the end of the day still ranked lower than his own son. Sasuke and Naruto did not like to be reminded of these facts, and they still held a slight grudge against Kakashi over the fiasco that had been their last attempt at the Chunin exams. It was probably petty of them, but seriously. Failing the first phase on a technicality? That was just infuriating. It was almost as bullshit as the time Naruto got disqualified in an earlier Chunin exam for using senjutsu, which Tsunade and the other organizers had banned seemingly just to spite him. This shit always seemed to go bad when they were involved. Even Boruto and Sarada hadn't been able to get through their own Chunin exams without a couple of extra-dimensional assholes coming in to crash the party. Really, it was almost like a curse or something. So when the Sandaime called them, Sakura, Hinata, Shikamaru, and Shino into his office, the two men in boys' bodies were naturally a little unsure how to react. They were almost afraid to get their hopes up. I suppose you are wondering why I called you here, the Hokage said, puffing on his pipe. The door to his office was closed behind the kids, and the Lord Third's son and daughter-in-law were hidden in the shadows, the elite Umbu operatives standing a silent, unseen vigil over Konoha's commander-in-chief. Naruto Uzumaki, Sasuke Uchiha, Hinata Hyuga, Sakura Harano, Shikamaru Nara, and Shino Aburame stood at attention. Half of them belonged to influential clans within the Hidden Leaf. A third of them were the scion of nearly extinct clans that had once been just as powerful, if not more so. Even the sixth of them was at least the child of two shinobi. Sakura was cheerfully grinning, and Hinata was more subtly smiling. Shino was stoic and as inscrutable as a tree, while Shikamaru looked like he was trying, very badly, to mask his disinterest. Naruto and Sasuke looked unsure what to think. I dare say we have a pretty good idea, Hokage-sama, Sakura chirped. She gave him a cheeky wink and theatrically bowed. Yeah. I'm sure you have an excellent reason, sir, said Shikamaru with just a touch of insolence. Hiruzen smiled. Haha, yes. That I do, he said. Congratulations. After thorough consideration, it has been decided that you six demonstrated sufficient merit for promotion during your exams. You are now Chunin. He unrolled a small storage scroll and swiped his thumb over the key. With a puff of smoke, 6 flak vests appeared on the surface of his desk. Shikamaru looked the exact opposite of thrilled. Shino was unreadable. Sakura and Hinata smiled pleasantly. Sasuke stared, and Naruto hummed. I would give a speech here about what an honor this is for you, and what responsibilities await you as newly appointed Chunin, the Sandaime said, but I think you kids already have the idea. He gestured for them to take the vests. So this is what it feels like to become a Chunin, Naruto idly said, grabbing a flak vest and throwing it on. Huh. Kinda underwhelming. Tell me about it, Sasuke muttered, nodding in agreement. He slung a flak vest over his shoulder, not bothering to don it. His expression was stolid and dour. "It's about damn time." Sakura sniggered, remembering how the last Chunin exam Naruto and Sasuke participated in went, and even Hinata had to stifle a slight giggle at their expense. Shino and Shikamaru gave the quartet an odd look. "Report in tomorrow for your first mission's assignments as Chunin," Hiruzen told the kids. "I hope you look forward to it." He then smiled and dismissed the newly confirmed Chunin with a wave of his hand. This was sure to be interesting. Sakura walked out of the movie theater with an enormous grin on her face. Her eyes were fiercely twinkling, and she gleefully rubbed her hands together. Next to her walked Hinata, who was humming to herself and absent-mindedly jotting down notes on a piece of paper. "Hee, Princess Gale is as gorgeous as I remember," Sakura remarked. Not to say that Lady Kazuhana wasn't still a total MILF, of course, but there's just something about a young woman in the prime of life. "It reminds me of the night we conceived Boruto," Hinata said wistfully. "It was our second anniversary, 10 at night or so, and we'd gotten through the library of her works up to this movie. The way Naruto blushed when he brought out the next film was so adorable, and, well, I could hardly say no to that face." Sakura perked up. "Was it the public release of the film?" she asked. "I remember there was a bit of controversy when it finally came out after the war. They had to sanitize the final cut a lot because of politics and all that. A pity, in my opinion." "Uncut and unrated," Hinata said, smiling. Apparently she had intended to send that edition to Lord Jiraiya, since he was the original author, but since he was dead by that point, well, apparently she wound up sending it to Naruto-kun instead, since he was Jiraiya's apprentice as well as a fond and respected acquaintance of hers. "The night of our second anniversary was the first time he ever watched it, though." Sakura pouted. "Do you still have it?" She gave Hinata a cutely imploring look. "I've secretly always wished I could see the restricted original version of the Icha movie. If I'd known Naruto had it." "I think we might still have it in storage," Hinata said, looking thoughtful. "Apart from our writing, we locked most of that stuff away after Bolt reached a certain age." "Oh. Can I borrow it when we get back?" Sakura asked. "I've wanted to talk Sasuke into having another kid for a while now." "Certainly, if I can find it," Hinata answered. Sakura squealed and gave the other girl a tight hug. "Eee. You're the best, Hinata," she gushed. Hinata smiled and waved it off, saying, "It's the least I can do. But that aside, we really should focus on our mission." Sakura let go, though not before planting a quick, blink-and-you'll-miss-it kiss on Hinata's cheek. "Yeah," she conceded. "Sexy starlets don't guard themselves, after all." She then winked, eliciting an amused giggle from Hinata. At that moment, Princess Gale went flying down the street on horseback, pursued by several men in military costumes of fake but convincing armor and weapons. Hinata cocked her head, and Sakura smiled. "Oh, my," said Hinata. "It looks like our charge is trying to escape." "Yeah," said Sakura, nodding. "We should probably stop her." Wriggling her fingers into a seal, the pinkette focused her chakra with a smile. The horses froze in place, some of them stopping so suddenly as to nearly throw their riders. Or actually throw them, in the runaway actress's case. But Yuki was lucky enough to be caught in midair, Hinata snatching the woman up before she could hit the ground. The Hyuga held the woman in her arms with no difficulty despite their difference in size, and came to a graceful landing on the side of the road. Several pedestrians stared in surprise. All of this happened in the amount of time it would take someone to blink, and civilians could hardly follow things moving that fast. "Yeah." Yuki Fujikaze blinked, looking left and right as she tried to process what the fuck had just happened. An elderly gentleman held an armful of cabbages and was propping up a teetering cart of produce with one foot, keeping it from spilling all over the street. He looked tense, exasperated, and harried. A gaggle of schoolgirls were squealing and holding down their skirts, faces beet red. Fluttering garments betrayed a strong breeze, and flustered expressions showed how little they appreciated it. The stuntmen and crew were sitting dumbly on their horses, foolishly staring as they limply clutched the reins of their steeds. Beneath them the horses were shivering and pathetically whinnying, some of them looking like they had frozen up mid-stride. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her face felt hot enough to fry an egg. Woozy, Yuki realized that she must have been tossed from her horse, and for a moment she supposed that she might have broken her neck and died. It certainly felt surreal enough. But then something squeezed, and the actress realized that she could feel a hand on her ass. Reacting on instinct, Yuki whipped out a can of mace and sprayed it into her molester's eyes. There was a moment of tense silence before Hinata let out a scream of pure agony and dropped her charge on the ground. Sakura winced in sympathy. Target acquired. Silent as a whisper, they stalked through the brush. Betraying not the slightest noise, communicating through glance and gesture, they coordinated themselves to slip as stealthily as shadows around their prey, hemming it in before it could even notice. Their formation was perfect. All they had to do was skulk in and close the net around their target. A breeze picked up. The ferret froze, eyes wide such that one might have related it to a human expression of shock, although the ferret of course did not use the same nonverbal language as humans. But it tensed regardless, leery and ready to run. Shit, a young man cursed, breaking the silence. Get it. Now. Simultaneously, acting as one at this command, 3 young teens pounced. Well, 2 pounced. Shino didn't do fumbling around like a jackass. Unless you counted Akamaru as well, in which case yes, it was indeed 3 pouncing, although the pup could not really be called a teen. Unless you were measuring by dog years, possibly, but that hardly counts in any serious discussion. Additionally, Naruto was only a teenager in the physiological sense, while mentally he was approaching middle age. So, to be exact, it was more like one young teen, one middle-aged man in a young teen's body, and a puppy pouncing on a cornered ferret. The classic comedic outcome for such a scene would have been for the ferret to evade them and get away, and it certainly danced out of Kiba's reach, ducked between Akamaru's legs, and shot past Naruto's outstretched hand. As a result, the 2 boys and 1 dog ended up in a tangled heap while their target made a break for it. Had this not been a part of their gambit, and indeed what they wanted the ferret to do, Kiba would have groaned in annoyance. He still shot Naruto a dirty look for coming up with a plan that left them in such an undignified state, and Akamaru whined. But as for the ferret, it wound up running straight into the hands of a camouflaged Naruto shadow clone, who grinned and raised the critter triumphantly into the air. Shino then checked to make sure that this was, in fact, the ferret they'd been hired to find. There was a moment's silence. A beat. This isn't the one, he said with just the slightest touch of disappointment in his stoic monotone. Kiba groaned. Seriously? He said. This is the 3rd one. How the hell many ferrets can there possibly be out here? Far more than 3, I'm sure, Shino deadpanned. Naruto laughed. Are you sure you don't want my help tracking it, Kiba? I'll find it on my own. Kiba sniped back, indignantly reddening. I don't need your help, Naruto. What do you know about tracking anyways? Well, I am a sensor type, Naruto nonchalantly replied. Kiba scowled and crossed his arms over his chest, giving a theatrical harumph. He muttered under his breath and turned to face his canine companion, bending over to talk with the dog and make a point of ignoring Naruto. Shino sighed and pushed his sunglasses up the bridge of his nose. This was totally not just an excuse to flip off his comrades. Seriously, though, what are the odds of us finding one specific ferret in all this wilderness? Kiba wondered aloud, more sheer grumbling than anything else. The second he said that, Akamaru barked, and a squealing, beige and brown ferret went darting past their feet. Naruto stooped to pick it up, catching the critter without even blinking, and he smiling when he saw 2 beady red eyes looking up at him. Shino cocked an eyebrow. Hey, Naruto said, smiling at the furious little creature. You're Narogui, aren't you? Kiba sidled over and looked down at the ferret, which was wriggling and squealing in Naruto's hand. He looks like the picture, all right, the boy said. Talk about a lucky break. The ferret bared its teeth and snapped at Kiba, continuing to angrily claw Naruto's hand. It seems frantic, Shino commented. Something must have upset it very badly to send it running like that. What do you suppose it might have been? Akamaru barked again, quite suddenly, and that was all the warning the 3 humans had before a half-dozen bulky, heavily armored forms came barreling through the forest. Twigs snapped under iron-shod boots, and big studded maces were hefted and swung in menacing arcs. Glowing red motes that were presumably eyes glared out from slits in thick helms. A beat. That. Yeah, I think it was that. Yes, Shino nodded. You're probably right. The nearest one raised its morning star and swung it down. Naruto and Kiba jumped aside, but Shino did not. He didn't have to. His form broke apart into a glistening swarm of insects, and the Chidi noose mass promptly engulfed the head of the mace. Within seconds Shino's Kikaicha had traveled up the handle of the bludgeon and swarmed over the dumpy, armored assailant. Had it still been human, the wretched pawn would have screamed as the insects forced their way down its throat, and in through every other orifice as well. Its fellows pushed past it even as it stumbled and staggered, before collapsing lifeless to the ground. Kiba and Akamaru were ready to let loose with their Gatsuiga combo by that point, however, and tore one of the armored things into pieces. Naruto casually slapped a Rasengan into the gut of the third one. The remaining three armors charged forward, heedless of any peril. Under a glaring sun, in a hot and arid wasteland, a caravan trundled along. Wagons towed by exotic beasts of burden left dozens of overlapping impressions in the dust and dirt behind them, hoof tracks and footprints peppering the ruts. It was dry as a bone and hot as hell. Itachi Uchiha wiped a few beads of sweat from his brow, eyes briefly closing. He cast off the moisture with a flick of his wrist, ponytail whipping fabulously behind him. The droplets seemed to catch the sunlight, freezing in midair, and the hearts of every androsexual person in the caravan skipped a beat watching him. Several ladies, and more than a few gentlemen, as well, swooned. Itachi seemed oblivious to the throbbing hearts left in his wake, and continued to walk alongside the caravan. Beside him was his younger brother Sasuke. Behind them, in the caravan's wake, were the insensate bodies of a few dozen bandits who had made the terrible life choice of barging in on a conversation between the two Uchiha siblings, even apart from putting themselves at odds with the two as far as their mission to protect this caravan. All 40-odd of the brigands had been defeated in a matter of seconds. So, as I was saying, Sasuke said, this guy assured me there was no way his plan could fail, but of course my backup arrived in the middle of his speech. You should have seen the look on his face when he saw that katana poking out of his gut. He might have survived that, but the evidence I'd collected was still enough to get him arrested and his operation shut down permanently. So he wasn't too happy, as you can imagine. Itachi nodded along with this story, smiling absently. You've had an eventful life, he remarked. I'm sorry about all the trouble I put you through, but I'm also glad you were able to find happiness. Was it eventful? Sasuke inclined his head. I suppose so. In hindsight, a lot of my problems were self-inflicted, so to speak, but I managed to come out on the other end more or less intact. I think that might be all that really matters. Itachi smiled a little more. Several of the people looking in his direction felt their hearts flutter, regardless of their normal orientation. Tell me more about your family, he said. What's there to tell? Sasuke replied. A smile tugged at his own lips, and his eyes gleamed with something not dissimilar to mischief. You'll have to find out for yourself what that's like. Is this an admission that you're the one who has been setting me up on those blind dates? Nonsense. Why would I ever subject you to something like that? Sasuke sniffed, an obvious evasion. The same incomprehensible, alien logic that causes anyone to try and pair off the people around them, I'm sure, Itachi said smoothly. Hey, don't lump me in with shippers, Sasuke said, giving his brother an annoyed look. Itachi smirked. Aha. So it was you, he said victoriously, eyes twinkling. GRK, Sasuke winced, face reddening. Clearing his throat, he shiftily said, I admit nothing. Of course you don't, Itachi said, nodding knowingly. There was a moment of silence after this, before he eyed Sasuke thoughtfully and asked. But as a side note, what do you mean by shipper? Well, it's kind of a long story, Sasuke replied, looking sheepish. You had to have been there, I suppose. Have you heard of the Icha series? Itachi blushed beet red, before looking away and coughing into a tightly clenched fist. Yes. I have, he said, appearing shifty-eyed. Not that I've, read them or anything. Sasuke cleared his throat a tad uncomfortably, cheeks similarly pink, before continuing. Well, this series has continued for many years, he explained. It has a very large and devoted fan base, with unofficial fan magazines early on, and these magazines had sections where people would share or submit their own stories set in the Icha universes. And character romances were a very popular subject with this fan-made fiction, or fanfiction, if you will, to the extent that, well, Sasuke cleared his throat, obviously not the most at ease with this topic of discussion. For a moment he paused, as though unsure where to go next with his explanation or how to put into the words the sheer unbridled insanity that was the internet and all the bizarrely specific kinds of communities that had sprouted up in its dark and baffling depths. He was so blatantly uncomfortable, and so at a loss for how to explain these things to his brother who lived in an era where computers were still basically just glorified number machines and technologically distributed mass media outside of books and magazines was virtually non-existent, that when someone spoke up and interrupted him one could actually see the sigh of relief he stifled. "Hey, you." "Yes," Sasuke said, promptly turning to face the speaker. He saw that it was the son of their client, a bespectacled young boy with a passing resemblance to himself as a child. Hikaru, son of Prince Mikuru, scowled and looked back down at the screen of his handheld. He sniffed with imperious disdain as he returned to the lofty task of beating up pixelated foes. "Humph. Never mind," the boy muttered. Sasuke twitched. This kid was an insufferably spoiled brat, and while he had dealt with worse, it was still hard not to betray any hint of irritation or annoyance at the twerp's juvenile power plays. It took him a lot more effort than he would gladly admit to keep his expression blank in the face of this impudence. "I do not envy anyone who has to watch over that child," Itachi remarked. "He's just annoying," Sasuke said. It seemed like he was saying this as much to himself as to Itachi, as though he had to remind himself more than anyone else that these were just petty, inconsequential vexations. "I was on a team with Naruto and Sakura. I can handle annoying. They didn't seem that annoying to me." "Of course they don't. They've matured. But they used to be annoying, as kids." Sasuke shivered. "They were the worst," he said emphatically. "Even if I did eventually grow fond of it, they were still just completely." "I think I get it," Itachi said, nodding. "You're at Tsundere, aren't you?" Sasuke tripped and fell flat on his face. Hokage's office. Timeline Gamma. The future. Kakashi had never dreamed about becoming Hokage, that had never been his goal. Even as a kid he'd been smarter than to want this job, leaving it up to Obito to go around dreaming about stupid things, and to Sensei to actually be a good candidate for the job. No, in an ideal world Kakashi never would have become the Hokage. His team would have survived the war, Sensei would have held the title for more than a year, and maybe Obito would have eventually been chosen as the Yondaime's successor. Perhaps Naruto would have even become the Rokudaime, after Obito. But not Kakashi. Only necessity could have forced him into this position, that, and a request from a friend. So if Kakashi had any reason to hate Obito, it wasn't for masterminding Akatsuki's schemes, starting the Fourth Great Ninja War, indirectly bringing death and crippling injuries to thousands of people, and sinking the economy of the 5 principal territories into the shitter for nearly a decade. It was for guilting him into becoming Hokage in a period of reconstruction and renewal, forced to puzzle out a new order for the world of shinobi alongside the other 5 Kage, and go prematurely gray from stress. Although his hair had always been gray. But, the point is that Kakashi was not one of those people who had dreamed of becoming a Kage. It was hardly his dream job, and he did it only because the village needed him to. Frankly, he had seen himself as just a placeholder for until Naruto was ready to take the hat. Kakashi was a ninja. Not a politician, not a bureaucrat, but a ninja. Working in an office environment was his own private hell. Responsible or not, dutiful or not, able to make a game out of paperwork or not, he had still been relieved down to his soul when he'd finally passed the torch on to Naruto. And sure, he still stayed on in an advisory capacity, helping the Nanodaime out every so often, whether by providing a sounding board for ideas or just waking the poor bastard up when he looked ready to collapse from stress and exhaustion. But now he had to actually take over for Naruto because his students' kids had gone and done something stupid like messing around with time travel jutsu. Ugh. Kakashi was fond of the squirts, and respected them as exceptionally skilled young shinobi, but that did not excuse them from occasionally doing very stupid things. They were as bad as their parents in that regard. Well, not so much Hinata. Anyone who could write with such love for the original Ichiicha deserved the utmost respect as an author, in Kakashi's mind. Naruto got off a little lighter too, in this regard, although it had been a while since he'd written one by himself. The Lord Sixth shook his head, then, realizing that his attention was straying. Sighing, he focused back on the paperwork in front of him. It had been a while since he'd had to do this, and it seemed he'd fallen out of practice in regards to not getting bored out of his skull. Hopefully the kids would be returned to normal before he had to relearn that skill. Tsunade got off lucky, he mused to himself, skimming his eyes over another form. Just having to cover for Sakura, and with Shizune's help at that. Although I suppose that at her age even that much must be rather taxing. A slightest prickle of fear ran down Kakashi's spine. Blinking and looking up from the papers, he saw the visage of the woman in question. It appeared she was giving a good college try at killing him with just a look, judging by the intensity of her death glare. At whose age, Kakashi? Tsunade said darkly, crossing her arms over her ample chest. The Rokudaime absent-mindedly thought of his penpal Kaiyu, the lovely Yuki clanswoman and chief warden of Haujikiju, whose letters were possibly the only thing in the world that he enjoyed reading more than Ichiicha. Idly, he wondered how she was doing. No offense intended, Tsunade-sama, he drawled, scribbling his signature onto another form. You are getting on in years. I'm not so old that I can't beat some respect into that head of yours, she retorted with a scowl. I don't doubt it, Kakashi said blandly. But I'm sure you didn't come here just to threaten me. Humph. Of course I didn't, Tsunade sniffed. I'm here to find out about the progress those kids have made on the jutsu. The sooner they get it done, the sooner I can get back into retirement. I could assign Mitsuki to help lighten your load, Kakashi offered. He's not as experienced, but he's the closest to being on your, Sakura's, or Shizune's level in medical ninjutsu. Tsunade narrowed her eyes and rested a hand on the Hokage's desk. Kakashi. She growled. They're doing their best, he said. But it's a very complicated matter. Space-time jutsu are only poorly understood even in this day and age, and time travel jutsu infinitely less so. How long? Maybe 3 months, at the most optimistic, but probably closer to half a year, if we're being realistic. Kakashi paused and gave her a sympathetic look. I don't like it either, but there's no way Naruto, Sakura, or the others are in any state to do their duties. We'll have to cover for them for the foreseeable future. She scowled. Damn. And there's no way we can train them to take care of their usual jobs? Not even a little. Kakashi gave her an odd look. It took them decades to get this far, he said. Even if you gave them a crash course, there's no way you could teach them more than a tiny fraction of everything they would need to know. We're on our own. Ugh, Tsunade groaned. I'm too old for this garbage. I agree, said Kakashi. She glared daggers in response. Chapter 33, Things Happen. A boat headed to Yuki no Kuni. Timeline Beta. The past. I'm not going. You can't make me. Actress Yuki Fujikaze, or Princess Koyuki Kazuhana, rather, stomped and raged at her manager and loyal attendant. She gestured angrily, sweeping her arms over the deck and the open sea around them. I refuse to go to the land of snow. I will not go. Sandai Uesama stood firm, handling the prima donna's complaints with all the cool expertise of a true professional. We're going there whether you like it or not, he said. The director insists on shooting the film there. You're the one who gave him the idea, weren't you? Said Yuki venomously, shooting a glare at the man. Perhaps I was, Sandai said diplomatically, adjusting his glasses. But it doesn't change the fact that we're heading to the land of snow either way. They won't turn this boat around for anything. They can't shoot a thing if I refuse to act, the intransigent princess growled. Defiance kindled in her eyes. If you refuse to act, what will happen to your career? Sandayu rebuked, frowning disapprovingly. If we go to the land of snow, I won't have a career. Koyuki shot back. Sakura and Hinata watched this back and forth with bemused expressions. Seated on crates of filming equipment, they observed the unfolding drama. Sakura's cheeks were resting in her hands, and she was boredly kicking her feet back and forth. Meanwhile, Hinata distractedly worked on her knitting. 2 pairs of thick, fluffy mittens, as well as long johns and sweaters, were neatly stacked up next to the Hyuga, Uzumaki, by marriage, and her legs were motionless as she worked. Needles clacked together as she worked indigo yarn into the shape of a scarf, and her sclera still held a bit of lingering redness from the agonizing ocular irritant their charge had sprayed into her eyes. Yuki-chan's kind of a bitch, isn't she? Sakura mused. I can't believe she used to be this bad. How'd I ever forget? She has her reasons, I'm sure, Hinata said, deftly clicking her needles. She blinked once, twice. She's spent all this time in exile, hasn't she? She must be deathly afraid of what will happen if she returns. Deposed royalty rarely get a pleasant deal from their usurpers. Maybe, Sakura hummed, shrugging. Doesn't change the fact that she's a total bitch, though. I think it's a charm point, Hinata replied. At first she's aggressive and confrontational, but as you get to know her she opens up and reveals a tender, kind, but insecure young woman. Really? But that is so cliché, you know. Sakura rolled her eyes. Just because she's pretty doesn't mean she's automatically a good person deep down. She was when we knew her, Hinata said. Sakura frowned and mulled this over for a second. Well. Yeah, that's true. I guess, she said. Doesn't mean she's not acting like a bitch now, though. One might say that you used to be the same way. Hinata smiled pointedly. Okay, fair enough. Sakura winced. I guess it didn't help matters that I drugged her to get her on board, either. At least you didn't take advantage of her while she was unconscious, Hinata said sweetly. Please. Like you're one to talk, Sakura snarked, looking amusedly at the redness in Hinata's eyes. She smirked and lowered her voice a bit more. How was it, anyways? Soft, Hinata promptly answered. But quite well-shaped. A grin. You don't say. Sakura whispered dreamily, staring in the direction of the topic of their discussion. She giggled with a perverted expression that would have been perfectly at home on Jiraya's face. Hinata shook her head, although she was smiling indulgently. Incorrigible, she sighed. Guilty as charged. Sakura tittered. They both laughed, earning them an odd look from Koyuki. Lying flat on his back, Temujin stared up at the sky and tried to figure out when the hell his life had descended into this absurd carnival of madness. Implausibly pretty purple irides rimmed unfocused pupils as dimmed and glassy eyes gazed hopelessly at the heavens continuing in their endlessly wheeling course high above, utterly indifferent to the troubles of the insignificant creatures fighting and suffering over this tiny speck of dust. A slender, double-edged knight's arming sword lay snapped and blunted beside a twisted, shapeless hunk of metal that had once been a folding shield built into a sleek vambrace adorning his off-arm. The long-haired blonde had a split lip, a broken nose, a cut bleeding somewhere in his hairline, and one hell of a shiner ruining the symmetry of an otherwise very pretty face. These were all courtesy of the savage, tattooed youth who had assaulted him while he was in the process of carrying out his master's work, his master whose name he was having a really hard time remembering at the moment. Scowling, Temujin looked bitterly askance at his assailants. You don't understand what you're doing, he said lowly, glowering at the one who wore glasses with strange, darkly tinted lenses. I'm here to help my master to help him make peace. Perhaps it was the ringing in his ears, or the spots still dancing in his eyes, but after saying this Temujin got the feeling that his wording wasn't quite right. But he didn't care about coherence. He was dizzy, bruised, and angry. Peace is nice. It's a commendable goal, said one of the other boys, a squinty-eyed blonde noisily slurping noodles from an odd container. It almost looked like a cup made out of some kind of paper or something. But a lot of people tend to go about it in all the wrong ways. And, to be honest, I find it really hard to see a pack of possessed suits of armor tromping through the middle of nowhere with big-ass cudgels as messengers of harmony and goodwill. You wouldn't understand, Temujin reflexively retorted. It's all part of Lord. He paused, struggling to remember his master's name. After a few seconds he gave up and just lamely said, my lord's plan to make people, peaceful and stuff. I think you hit him a little too hard, Kiba, said the bespectacled one with the incongruously deep voice and high-collared shirt. The tattoo-cheeked brute with prominent fangs and sharp, almost claw-like fingernails scoffed. He was wearing a helmet, protested the youth who was apparently named Kiba. You hit him hard enough to split that helmet, the one with the dark glasses replied. Bah! Kiba scoffed. I barely left a scratch on him. He's probably just naturally stupid, Shino. I mean, just look at his hair. Shino quirked an eyebrow and looked silently from Temujin to their third cohort. Hey! Some of the smartest people I know are blonde, said the noodle-slurping lad, giving Kiba a lazy gimlet eye. But not like this guy, Kiba scoffed. It's practically white. What did he do? Soak his head in bleach until it seeped through to his brain. Ino's hair is about the same shade, isn't it? And she had the best overall grades in our class. Better than Sasuke or Sakura, even. That doesn't mean a thing, and you damn well know it, Naruto, Kiba scoffed. Just look at Shikamaru and... He paused, staring at Naruto for a moment, before sniffing and trailing off. Well, besides, any girl who can obsess over a gloomy jerk like Sasuke when this stud is in the room must have something wrong with her head. He jabbed a thumb against his chest and tilted his head up with a smirk, looking unimpeachably cocksure. Naruto snorted, and Shino pushed his sunglasses up the bridge of his nose. Whatever you say, the former chuckled. Aren't you seeing a girl already, though? She's just a friend. Kiba blushed and recoiled, sounding suspiciously defensive. It's not like we're trading naked pictures like Shino and his penpal. Shino glared at Kiba. An impressive thing, getting this across when his eyes and half his face were concealed, but he made his vexation perfectly clear simply by furrowing his brow and softly clearing his throat. Ahem. That only happened once, Kiba, and it was solely on her end, Shino said dangerously. Fusan is, very innocent in a way, and she simply didn't understand why it might be appropriate to send me a picture of herself in the bath. He paused. And besides, nothing was actually visible below the water. Shino adjusted his glasses, saying this. Temujin spotted a light flush in the taciturn boy's face, and he momentarily pondered why Shino had felt a need to add that clarification. Then he stopped and stared at the sky, realizing that the people who had beaten him up were now completely ignoring him in favor of petty banter and bickering. He wasn't sure what to think of this. Sasuke winced as he listened to the woman inside the house yell at her estranged husband. Their conversation was loud enough to be easily heard, and he could hardly help listening in. Partly because it was their job to make sure nothing bad happened to the prince or his son. Still, he couldn't help feeling sorry for the poor, foolish bastard. Mikuru really had no clue, did he? Not that Sasuke could entirely blame him. Some girls might find it romantic to be willing to give up rule of your kingdom to be with them, but Amiya seemed to have some very strong opinions about birthright and responsibility. In a way, it reminded Sasuke a little of his own wife. Very tangentially, to be fair, and their approaches were quite different in the specific details, but the overall sentiment of a woman waiting for the man she loved to come to his senses was there in both cases. Wryly, nostalgically, he thought of the price Sakura had extracted from him their first night together in over a decade, after the whole debacle with that Shin fellow and his clones. Get in here, Buster. We have 11 years of sex to catch up on, and I am not letting you weasel out of this until you have paid your dues for every lonely night. With interest. Despite the danger in her words, or perhaps because of it, that night had probably been the best sex of their lives, and the first time they had ever used infinite Tsukuyomi for marital fun. It certainly was not the last, of course, and over the past few years they'd made plenty of goes at outdoing that night. They hadn't managed yet, but certainly not for lack of trying. Louder than ever, Amiya shouted at her former husband. Sasuke winced. Next to him, Itachi looked concerned. It sounds like it might get violent in there, Itachi remarked, standing on the other side of the entryway. Should we intervene before it can escalate? There's a time and place for couples to argue, and it sounds like his wife has a lot to get off her chest, Sasuke said. He shook his head. No, it might be better in the long run if we let them air their grievances now. For their relationship's sake. Itachi cocked his head. You make it sound like you're an expert on marital spats, he said. Not really. My wife and I have only had a couple real fights over the years, but they were all over kind of big problems. Sasuke gave his brother a sideways look. Circumstances have kept us apart for long stretches of time in the past, and those absences would naturally breed an issue or two. But we've worked through them all, even if it's taken a lot of yelling, a lot of expensive dinners, and a lot of make-up sex. I see, Itachi said, blushing and looking distinctly, awkwardly uncomfortable. Well, good for you. Yes. Yes, it most certainly is, Sasuke said absently. His mouth twitched briefly into a dreamy smile, and he looked up at the sky. At that moment, young Hikaru came barreling out the door as his parents shouted his name. Tears were streaming from his eyes as he rushed past Sasuke and Itachi, seemingly ignoring them as he dashed through the grass. The two brothers shared a look. I'll talk to the boy, Itachi decided, looking a touch grateful for this interruption. You can have a discussion with his parents. Does that sound fair? No problem, was Sasuke's reply. Someone has to give those two love-struck idiots some marriage counseling. Itachi smiled. You think you can handle it, then? I'll have them back together and making up for lost time in an hour, said Sasuke. Two tops. I have plenty of experience with this kind of thing from dealing with Karen and Suijutsu. I've told you about them, right? Oh, the belligerent lovebirds? Yes, you have, Itachi said, nodding. It sounds like they were quite the handful. You have no idea. Sasuke shuddered. If they weren't having a screaming fight, they were having screaming sex, either way, invariably when you were trying to sleep. More than once I had to talk Sakura down from murdering them at 1 in the morning, back during her pregnancy. A pause. That's an interesting mental image, Itachi commented, weakly grimacing. I said talk her down, Sasuke corrected. Not, you know. Oh, Itachi said. He colored immensely. For a moment, an awkward silence reigned between the brothers. It lasted right up until Itachi vanished in a puff of smoke. Sasuke, smiling to himself, turned and headed inside the house. Secure training facility. Timeline Gamma. The future. Naruto swore angrily as he fell down on his back, glaring impotently up at the training post. His fists were burning, his joints were aching, and his spine was screaming in protest of his actions. Calloused hands, hard and strong, felt sore and feeble as he uncurled them with a cringe. His chest rose and fell with heavy breathing, and bullets of sweat ran down his face. His shadow clones dissipated in bursts of smoke and low popping noises, vanishing into thin air. A sore and aching body protested every movement, and he felt a weight of fatigue like he had never felt in his life. His lungs burned and his muscles throbbed as he greedily swallowed small gasps of air. Despite the reflexes engraved in every nerve and sinew of his body, the strength of perfectly chiseled muscles and bones like steel bars, and a chakra that was quickly rising to the challenge of its gulfsome vessel, Naruto felt pointedly aware of how meager his abilities were. After the high of realizing that he did become Hokage had finally declined, he soberly realized just how far he was from living up to the reality. He'd challenged an adult, goateed Kiba to a spar. And lost. Miserably. He hadn't even gotten a single hit in. He'd rushed his opponent only to get swatted aside with ease. Even getting up and attacking again did nothing, he was utterly helpless in his opponent's hands, tossed about like a leaf in the wind. The problem, according to his foe, had been simple. I never believed I'd have to say this about you, Naruto, but you're putting way too much thought into your moves, the bearded Kiba had told him, struggling to fight down a smug grin. You come at me thinking, I'm gonna punch you, and you telegraph this so hard that I couldn't miss it if I was blind and deaf. You focus so much on just hitting me that you ignore everything your body already knows about fighting, and it knows a lot more than you do. Naruto glared at the training post, with its dented sides and smooth worn edges, silently wishing he could have landed at least one blow on that condescending bastard. He grit his teeth and forced himself back onto his feet despite the aches and pains. Don't think, kid. Just feel. With a wordless growl, Naruto angrily threw himself once more at the training post, frustratedly bashing his fists against the hardened, unyielding material. Skulking bashfully in the shadows of the subterranean gym normally reserved for Umbu training exercises, Hinata watched her grown-up crush with a wistful expression. Naruto-kun. She whispered, clasping her hands. Even now, you're still. Sarada's eye twitched as she reviewed an equation Boruto had scrawled out, a lengthy jumble of letters and mathematical symbols that would have seemed incomprehensible even to a rocket scientist. She tried to focus on working through the formula and calculating whether it would balance out favorably to their latest approach, double-checking her boyfriend's work to make sure it was all mathematically, if not theoretically, sound. Boruto, bent double over a table laden with notes, calculations, jutsu formula sketches, and experimental data from their failed attempts was feverishly scribbling what looked like a harebrained seal formula that probably wouldn't solve anything, but might at least give them a little more insight. His face was screwed into a look of concentration, and his eyes were piercing the paper with an intense gaze as he worked. Under other circumstances, Sarada's heart might have fluttered at the sight of Boruto so intently focused, but the prick cling at the base of her neck reminded her of the other person in the room. Holding her breath and tapping a pencil against her cheek, the Uchiha heiress, for what that title was worth, felt a vein pop in her forehead while a pair of eyes bored into the back of her head. She grimaced irritably just thinking about it. Don't you have anything better to do? She asked, managing to not call him dad, which was handy as this person was not quite her father. Sasuke, sitting off to the side and thoughtfully watching Sarada work, slowly shook his head. Not aside from training, he said, and the doctor told me not to do that for more than 3 hours a day. I hear that didn't stop you from spending 12 hours in the training hall yesterday, Sarada dryly replied, still trying to parse the formula in front of her. Which, on half a night's sleep and 3 bottles of energy drinks, looked an awful lot like hopelessly staring at the paper and waiting for the problem to solve itself. Sasuke looked away and cleared his throat, cheeks reddening a shade. I have my reasons, he said evasively. You threw your back out, didn't you? She deadpanned, tapping her pencil on the paper, onyx eyes glaring icy death at the uncooperative formula through her plain-rimmed prescription lenses. Sasuke said nothing, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. That was answer enough. Sarada sighed. Never before had she thought that she would grow so weary of her father's presence, aside from those times he'd grilled Boruto over the destination of an alleged 8 p.m. team meeting that Kano Amaru and Mitsuki knew nothing about, or the time he escorted her home after a disastrous night on the town with Chocho, or the time he... Well, okay, despite the regret of him not having been there for the first decade of her life, as a teenage girl Sarada had to admit that having her dad around was usually more exasperating or embarrassing than not. And even if this was only her dad in body, and his 12-year-old self in spirit, there was still enough similarity there for her to unconsciously think of him as dad. Which made far too many things far too damned confusing. Groaning and squeezing her eyes shut as the writing on the paper seemed to transform into illogical scribbles, Sarada executed a flawless head desk maneuver. Ugh. The Gokage were an important political entity in the ninja world, not only as 5 of the strongest shinobi alive, but also as respected and admired pillars of their respective communities. In their home villages they were beloved war heroes, soldiers, and leaders who had risen above the rest to stand as larger-than-life symbols of the values shinobi held dear. More importantly, though, was the fact that they were all politicians. Bureaucrats. Combat prowess and impressive mission records were prerequisites, and strength was accounted more heavily than wisdom by many who thought of the Kage, but by and large the most important and necessary skills for these figures were management, delegation, and communication. Leadership wasn't easy. Whether you thought it was a quality certain people were born with or a skill people learned through practice, the Gokage were leaders of their villages, and of the shinobi union as a whole. This made it a curious situation, then, where most people favored Kage with demonstrable power and battle experience, rather than those with actual legislative or administrative talent. Even Gaara and Kurachuchi, hands down 2 of the most professional and presidential leaders in the principal territories, had been put into their current positions mostly because of their reputations as skilled fighters. Gaara was the former Jinchuriki of the One-Tailed Tanuki, Shikaku, and a shinobi possessing absolute control of sand in a village located in the middle of a massive desert. Kurachuchi was a genius kunoichi with an elemental kekai genkai and undisputed mastery of genjutsu, and rated at least proficient in a majority of the other classical shinobi disciplines. They were also, it should be noted, either relatives or disciples of previous Kage. Not just the Kaze Kage and Chuchikage, either. Out of the 5 shadows, the one with the weakest connection to their predecessors was Chujuura, who was neither a blood relative of any past Mizukage nor a student of any of them, or any teaching line descended from them. And even that was only because Kiri and the Land of Water had a long history of civil war and violence that left everything really chaotic and disjointed from one generation to the next, even at the highest levels. Gaara was the son of the 4th Kaze Kage, Kurachuchi was the granddaughter of the 3rd Chuchikage, Darui was an inheritor of the 3rd Raikage's ninjutsu and right hand of the 4th. And Naruto Uzumaki was the son of the 4th Hokage with an additional indirect relation to both the 1st, 2nd, and 5th, as well as a student of the 6th Hokage, and a student of the 3rd. So aside from being chosen more for strength than actual political skill, the Gokage were also largely in the positions they presently held because of dynastic nepotism, or at least that was how it would look to an outsider. The truth was significantly more complicated, though, and it was not as though the 5 Kage were unqualified for their positions, quite the contrary, each one was a gifted leader and shrewd administrator in their own right, and more than half of them had needed to overcome significant obstacles to get where they were today. Saying they held their present ranks only because they were students or descendants of past Kage would be both a gross oversimplification and an insult to their very real and significant qualifications. They honestly were good at what they did, even if much of their bureaucratic and legislative savvy had to acquired through on-the-job experience. Besides, they were as stated before incredibly beloved and venerated in their home villages. Whether it was Darui with his mile-long laundry list of military awards and citations for bravery, a leader of men and women who had fought in countless battles with a sterling track record, or Kurachuchi who had introduced valuable legislation in the years after the war and enacted wildly popular initiatives to fertilize and farm the rocky badlands around Iwa, using Doton and Sutan ninjutsu to make the land arable, and volcanic ash from her Kekai Genkai to render it profitably fertile. They were champions of the people and darlings of the press. In this age of mass media and the increasing political and economic relevance of a stable, unified shinobi alliance, where much of the explosive technological innovation enjoyed throughout the continent had its roots in research funded by and carried out in the major hidden villages, research that had quickly given birth to their too-fore undreamed-of possibilities when a minor decision of the Gokage, made as a gesture of good faith, enabled this knowledge to be shared between their villages. Virtually everybody knew who the Kage were. A generation prior, most civilians outside the hidden villages knew close to nothing about shinobi. Names like Madara Uchiha or Hashirama Senja would have elicited blank stares from the average merchant or farmer, and if they even knew what Kage or hidden villages were, that was significantly more than most people. But this had been changing for years, with more and more people realizing just how large of an impact the actions and policies of these mercenary city-states had on the world they lived in, as relatively cheap and affordable communications technology connected people in ways their ancestors could have never imagined. 50 years ago, if the Hokage had been bedridden or rendered unfit for duty, the only people affected by this, or even aware of it, would have been the inhabitants of their village. And even then, only if they kept their ear to the ground. It would have been covered up as much as possible, and it would have been very hard for the news to leak. But in a world with portable long-distance communications, online social media, and an ever-burning interest in the affairs of those at the top, even if the exact details never got out, it would be almost impossible to completely hide the truth. And needless to say, the other Gokage were naturally concerned to discover that the Lord 6th, Kakashi, was back in office as the acting Hokage with no information regarding Naruto besides a vague statement about nervous breakdowns. Gaara, the instant he learned of this, contacted his sister Tamari to ask after the Lord 7th. Naruto was a dear friend and comrade of the Kaze Kage, to an extent that a not insignificant subculture of yaoi fans existed in the Leaf and Sand, where the main subject of their interest was a hypothetical, or very real, as some adamant fans insisted, sexual relationship between the 7th Hokage and 5th Kaze Kage. 75ers, they called themselves. But the fascinating proliferation of Naruto fan art, doujinshi, and fanfiction among Suna and Konoha kunoichi aside, Gaara was naturally very concerned about his friend. And it did nothing to ease his concerns when Temari spent several minutes quibbling and dodging the question before finally admitting that she had sworn secrecy on the matter and thus presently could not actually tell anything to anyone who didn't already know, not even her baby brother, she'd told him. This only made Gaara more worried, and more curious. So he then tried calling Naruto's cell phone. There was no answer. Next, feeling increasingly perturbed, he called the Uzumaki's home phone. There was an answer this time, but it was the Hokage's 11-year-old daughter who picked up the phone, and she said that she didn't know anything concrete about what had happened to her parents, save that they were acting funny and not presently fit for duty. She also further claimed that her grandfather was currently looking after her, while her brother and Sarada tried to fix their parents. This was a very interesting choice of words to hear from a child as canny and perceptive as Himawari Uzumaki. Gaara then tried calling Boruto. He'd had to consult a secretary to dig up the young man's cell number, and finding it took several minutes during which he had ample time to fret and worry and try to calm himself and tell himself that it was probably nothing and things would be fine, only to think of new terrible possibilities and descend further into thinly veiled anxiety and borderline panic. Despite the unwaveringly stoic expression on his face, by the time Gaara was finally able to call young Boruto he felt like a nervous mess. Even a nice, private, his eyes only pic and text from Shijima did little to alleviate the Kazekage's burgeoning fears. Although it did make him a little more eager to wrap this up and get home as soon as possible. When the Hokage's son answered, after 2 rings, it was with a terse and snappish yeah. Trying to be patient, and to sound as calm and professional as possible, Gaara inquired after the state of the boy's father. Boruto muttered a curse in response, one Gaara only barely made out, before tiredly saying he was working on it. When Gaara asked what specifically Boruto was working on, the boy cursed again, this time quite audibly, and then the call was suddenly and rather suspiciously disrupted by a loud burst of static, right before disconnecting. Subsequent attempts to call back went completely unanswered. After this, Gaara took a deep breath and retrieved a careworn copy of Icha Politics signed by Naruto and Hinata from the bottom drawer in his desk. Locking the door to his office, Gaara turned to his favorite section, where the red-headed and sleep-deprived leader of Pune engaged in a threesome with his half-sister and wife, both of whom also happened to be his secretaries, while his best friend and object of a forbidden love, the blonde and blue-eyed leader of Honoha, watched alongside his beautiful and open-minded wife. Once Gaara had burned off some of the frustration and mellowed himself out, he took a moment to go to the bathroom and wash his hands before calling one of his fellow Kage. He was going to get to the bottom of this. Chapter 34, Movie Funtime. Konoha. Timeline Gamma. The future. My brother called me at work earlier today. Temari Nara said this to her husband as he passed her a cup of tea, her tone bland and matter-of-fact. They were seated across from one another at a table in the corner of the employee cafeteria in the service building behind Hokage Tower. Drab walls and plain tile floors were illuminated by humming fluorescent lights while a smattering of clerical ninja, secretaries, and off-duty guards ate bland, tasteless dishes just barely resembling actual cuisine. It was not anyone's first option to eat the food here, but not everyone had the time or energy to prepare bento every day, and unless one had a spouse or lover or friend making them for them, it was only natural that sometimes it might seem easier to simply swallow one's pride and choke down a cheap, government-sponsored meal than go through the trouble in the morning, or the night before. Shikamaru was lucky that his wife didn't mind preparing bento for him, so long as he took his lunch periods off to eat with her. Temari was not a homebody by nature, or the best cook out of her siblings, that distinction went to Kankuro, but she also knew how hopelessly lazy her husband could be and wasn't averse to negotiating compromises like this. If she made him lunch, he had to listen to her while he ate. Or carry on an actual conversation if he wanted any kind of dessert. And in fairness, he did usually pay for the tea, even if it was typically tepid and watery. After almost 20 years of marriage, this was a well-ingrained routine. Temari didn't go on that many missions these days, although she certainly continued to train and keep herself in fighting shape. Many kunoichi who had children tended to ease themselves into less physically demanding bureaucratic or administrative roles, if they stayed in active service at all. Maybe as much as a third didn't, preferring instead to become full-time mothers or caregivers. It was a matter of expenses as much as preference. Jonin, like Kurenai, or Tamari herself, were usually afforded excellent benefits and pensions, and while even Jenin had good healthcare and reasonable pay, raising a child took a lot of money. A Jonin could afford to basically retire even if they were a single mother, while a Chunin might take up a clerical job or do the occasional mission, and Jenin usually continued doing D-rank jobs as long as they were physically able. There were policies and programs to lighten the financial burdens and make child care affordable, but a lot of people liked to have some degree of breathing room, financially speaking, and shinobi tended to take a certain amount of pride in being able to provide for themselves. Theoretically, it was possible to raise a child purely on welfare, government benefits, or a meager genin pension, but it probably wasn't too comfortable. Of course, it also wasn't easy for the village to afford improved care without having taxes at a certain level, and almost nobody actually liked to pay taxes. Suggesting an increase of income or sales tax rates would amount to political suicide for the less savvy legislator. It took a lot of raw charisma, smooth talking, and convincing sounding arguments to get people to assent to even a marginal tax hike, let alone anything significant. And then, of course, any changes that did get signed off on would have to be integrated into the bureaucracy, which was a nightmare all its own, and something very few souls were brave or crazy or boring enough to dare, and speaking of which, he should really check up on the progress of that. Shikamaru blinked, finally processing what his wife had just said a couple of seconds earlier. Sometimes it was hard to switch his brain out of work mode, especially when he knew he'd have to switch it back again anyways relatively shortly, but Tamari was a formidable woman, and a person who did not cotton to being ignored. Slowly, the Hokage's advisor cocked an eyebrow. Was the call a family thing or a politics thing? He carefully inquired. Tamari rolled her eyes. Personal, she said. He was asking about Naruto. Oh. Fuck. Shikamaru grimaced, and not just because the cafeteria's tea was cheap, unpalatable swill. So it was Gaara, right? No, Kankuro, Tamari said. Of course it was Gaara. I see, Shikamaru said. He nodded in understanding, looking into the dregs of his teacup. Hopefully you didn't tell him anything. He gave Tamari a look of weary concern. This mess had not been easy on him. She snorted, unimpressed. I didn't, Tamari graciously assured her husband. Even if I think I really should have. I mean, honestly, whatever happened to transparency and international cooperation? This is the kind of thing the Shinobi Union should be told about, even if only so they can help cover for us while we fix the problem. We've been over this, Shikamaru sighed. Bringing the other villages, or even just the other Kage, in on the loop would complicate matters more than we can afford. If you ask me, we already have too many people in the know. Tamari rolled her eyes once more. Nice rhetoric, she drawled. But this is really just about saving face, isn't it? It would be inconvenient if too many people found out about this screw-up, Shikamaru conceded, shrugging helplessly. Boruto and Sarada are practically the face of Konoha's next generation. If they lose credibility, so does the village as a whole. Which is why you sent them into town wearing those signboards, huh? Well, it didn't exactly specify what sort of kinjutsu they messed around with, Shikamaru sheepishly defended, looking away and coughing into his fist. A beat. You let Boruto look at the forbidden scroll in the first place, didn't you? Tamari guessed, causing her husband to flinch and tense up. That's the only place he could have gotten hold of a jutsu like that, and you and Naruto are the only ones who could have authorized it. Shikamaru's face reddened, and he stared into the bottom of his cup. Tamari might have found his expression a little cute in another situation. It was a momentary lapse in judgment, that's all, he mumbled, a weak defense as they both recognized. Right, Tamari drawled. Like how it was only a momentary lapse in judgment when you tried to carry out an assassination job in a distant country, with just 2 Umbu backing you up, and not bothering to inform me, your friends, or anyone in the Shinobi Union. I refuse to dignify that with a response. Tamari sighed and shook her head. Whatever, I don't care, she said dismissively, changing tact. Feel free to keep the other Kage in the dark if you want, but don't expect me to lie to my brothers. Not without a better reason than what you've given me, at least. There was a moment of meaningful silence between them. And if I can't think of one? Shikamaru wondered aloud. A smirk tilted to Mary's mouth, and her eyes flashed with mischief. She leaned forward over the table, looking straight into her husband's eyes, and whispered in a husky tone. Then you'd better make it worth my while. Shikamaru met her glance and smiled crookedly, seeing what she was getting at. Where do you want me to make the reservations? And when for? Surprise me, Tamari said, shrugging. Whether it's a candlelit dinner, a night at a hotel, or a weekend at an onsen. I don't care, as long as you make it romantic. She then leaned back and sat in her chair as though nothing had just happened, no sign of her plot aside from the hint of a slight coy grin. Shikamaru laughed. Troublesome woman. Land of Snowboarder. Timeline Beta. The past. Sakura lazily ducked under a clumsy haymaker from the largest of the three snow ninja, a bored expression on her face. Her movements were smooth and swift, and knuckles glowed faintly as she clenched a fist and focused her chakra. Big, dumb, and ugly, she said, driving a brute force uppercut into the guy's stomach. Armor cracked at the impact of her fist, shards of metal and crystal flying off. Thick, heavy limbs splayed while beady eyes bugged out, hairline cracks spreading through the abdomen of a chakra tech suit, a not inconsiderable weight suspended on Sakura's knuckles. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Crunch. Then the armor shattered, a compact fist continued driving up into an unprotected belly, and the big guy spewed a disgusting mixture of blood and spittle. A pathetic gagging, heaving, whimpering sound escaped his mouth before his eyes rolled up in their sockets and his body went limp. He fell from Sakura's fist and into the snow, causing a muffled thump. His expression was frozen in a mask of shock. Elsewhere on the glacier, Hinata ran circles around the sole female opponent, weaving and spiraling between frenzied attacks, gracefully dodging and disorienting her foe. Her Byakugan was active, giving the lass a fierce, slightly inhuman look, and it barely helped that her lips were locked into a stern frown. Obligatory kunoichi, she added, coming in from behind her dizzied enemy. Arms were a blur as her hands lashed out, jabbing fingers into the violet's back. Metal plate and composite unraveled before the Hyuga clan's all-seeing eyes, and bursts of chakra were shunted into structural loopholes, technical weak points in the experimental absorption mechanisms around which the armor had been constructed. These openings were no bigger than the eye of a needle at their largest, and very few people could have boasted the insight to detect them, let alone the precision and control necessary to exploit them. Hinata was one such person. The boob plate armored Fubuki blinked owlishly for a moment, slowly processing the fact that something had just happened. Realizing the enemy was behind her, she started to turn around as quickly as she was able, bringing an arm up as though preparing to deliver a retaliatory blow. But then she staggered and swayed on her feet. Her arm fell uselessly down to her side before she had spun all the way around, and her eyes rolled up in the back of her head. She tripped and fell mid-rotation, toppling bonelessly into the snow and ice. Hinata let out a carefully controlled breath, standing over her opponent in a picture-perfect gentle fist stance. She looked over at Sakura and offered a smile. Then they turned to face the third enemy combatant. And the pretty one, they said together, sounding distinctly unimpressed. Nadare Ruga, who stood poised above the two on an icy outcropping, looked at the insensate forms of his allies and went a fascinating shade of puce. What the hell? He muttered, eyes wide in disbelieving horror. That's a weirdly prevalent pattern, isn't it? Said Sakura sotto voce. Big guy, pretty boy, and chick. We seem to run into a lot of enemies who organize themselves that way. Indeed, it is a curiously ubiquitous trend, Hinata agreed. Like how genin squads almost always seem to have a 2:1 ratio of boys to girls. Heh, well that's just love triangle fodder, Sakura said, eyes twinkling mischievously. Or threesomes in the making. Hinata giggled. Oh, please. She said. You really are incorrigible, Sakura. What would your daughter say if she heard you talking like that? What would your daughter say? Sakura blithely riposted. Sarada knows what I'm like. She'd probably just grimace and pretend she didn't hear anything. Himawari is an unblemished angel, Hinata said demurely, eyes flashing. And I will kill anyone who tries to corrupt her. She's a bloodthirsty psycho in the guise of a moblob, Sakura snorted, smirking. Corrupting her would be like getting a toadstool moldy. She's a sweet child, though, Hinata said. She smiled. And I love her no matter what she's like. Nadare twitched. Sakura smiled. That's true, she conceded. And she is a nice kid most of the time. Just has a hell of a temper. Gee, that almost reminds me of someone else, Hinata sing-songed, giving the pinkette a wink. Sakura gave an uproarious guffaw. You cheeky bitch. She laughed. Ha. I don't know whether to punch you or kiss you. The latter might prove a useful distraction, Hinata remarked. Only if we were fighting a Lilicon, Sakura snorted. And if we were, well, he is kinda cute. For a younger man, at least. He's also the enemy, Hinata said. No matter how handsome he is. Well, sure. I mean, yeah, he pales next to Sasuke, Sakura said. But who's to say we can't kick his ass and win him over, then? It would also probably be inconvenient for our other selves, once things went back to normal, Hinata quietly pointed out. Sakura blinked owlishly. Oh, hell. Yeah, it probably would. Damn. She crossed her arms over her chest and scowled. Well, I guess we have no choice but to beat the Lilicon out of him, in that case. Nadare snapped. Damn it. Who do you think you're calling a Lilicon? He roared in furious protest, face livid. Ice style, snow whale jutsu. The glacier trembled, and with the thunderous roar of an avalanche a great mass of snow and ice fell like the stroke of God's hammer. Thought and Chakra shaped a hill's worth of debris, massaging it into the form of an enormous baleen whale. Undulating hypnotically, it swam through the air with a ponderous grace, barreling towards Hinata and Sakura at the speed of a runaway bullet train. Frosty flukes and ice-edged fins gleamed in the cold, harsh light of an Arctic sun. An immense bulk of tightly packed snow pushed through the atmosphere with an audible, nay deafening rush of wind that stirred whirling devils of flake and mist to dance fearfully away from the point of swiftly approaching impact. If this was something that could be averted by human power, then it certainly didn't look the part. Yet Sakura rolled her eyes, while Hinata smiled and shook her head. Geez, Sakura said in a bored tone. Seems like someone's in denial. You wanna take this one, Hinata? It would be my pleasure, Hinata sweetly replied. Then she slipped into a gentle fist stance, before vanishing among the twisting, twirling vortices of flying snowflakes caught in the bow wave of the descending ice whale. A moment later, there was a loud crack. Nadare felt something give beneath his feet. His focus wavered as he began to plummet, a startled brain struggling to reorient itself as the cliff he'd been standing on crumbled apart. As he fell from his perch, the snow ninja saw a crevice form in the side of the glacier beneath his shattering foothold, a gaping crack that split further open as he watched. Looking down to the base of the peak, he saw the Hyuga girl standing there with 2 fingers jammed into the crack. It took him a moment to realize that she had caused the crevice, even as a thick sheet of ice began to shatter and fall from the face of the mountain, dislodged by a force akin to the strike of a giant's ice pick. Disbelieving what he saw, Nadare turned his head only to witness the plume of a blizzard erupting from thin air where his snow whale should have been. Sooner, this time, he realized the cause. Mostly because he saw the pink-haired Kunoichi burst knuckles first from the eye of the storm and understood that she had punched it into smithereens. It was around this point that he closed his eyes and welcomed the sweet embrace of death. Meanwhile, the director shouted at the crew to keep filming from their vantage point by the shore, and Koyuki abandoned all pretenses of staying in character. No one will ever believe this, she said, her outfit disheveled and hairpiece askew. The actor playing Shishimaru nodded dumbly in silent agreement. Let me go. No. Let me go. No. Let me go. No. No, 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 no. Akamaru was riding atop his master's head as Kiba bickered with Temujin. The blonde knight's hair, at the same time, appeared to have come down with a ferret infestation, amounting to a grand total of 1 ferret. So really not much of an infestation at all, when you think about it. More like Narugui had simply taken up residence in Temujin's tresses, much to the lad's chagrin. Please let me go. Temujin said this with a grimace that may have been his go at a placating smile. No, Kiba said stubbornly. No way. You're a prisoner. You attacked us. Why the hell would we ever let you go, damn it? Akamaru yelped as though to punctuate this sentence. Narugui chittered and cocked his head, like he was responding to the pup. Akamaru bared his teeth and growled. Easy, Akamaru, said Shino. We still have to return the ferret to its owners. Huh, Naruto said out of nowhere. I wonder how they lost him, anyways? That is, why did he go missing to begin with? It's a ferret, Kiba said. Not that smart, right? Probably just went chasing after a rodent or some shit and nobody noticed until it was gone. And they hired a ninja team to track him down rather than look for him themselves? Yeah, that sure makes sense, not like this is any significant distance away from Konoha and in the time it would have taken for them to get a message to the village, their request to be processed, and us to get out here and find the little guy, any number of things could have happened to him. Naruto whistled and shook his head. Seriously, wow, this has to be one of the most weirdly pointless missions ever. Like this was all just a contrived excuse to get us out here to cross paths with Temujin and his armor stooges. You're sounding like a conspiracy theorist, Kiba quipped. Hey, they're not conspiracies when you live in a world where everyone has a secret agenda, Naruto said. You have to consider every possible angle. Like Hato's harem. Kiba stared. Who? Shino said. Temujin choked. They don't like being called that, he said. Trust me. Also, how do you know about them? And what does that have to do with your point? I'm a ninja, Naruto said blithely. Or a spy, in some contexts. And spies know everything. Like how Ranka and friends are currently in the process of a failed naval invasion of Suna territory, and really, that was just a terrible idea. Did Hato not do any research on the people he was trying to conquer? You didn't even know what chakra was before you fought us, and you're supposed to be like his right-hand man. Yeah, that's pretty dumb, Kiba agreed. If you plan on picking fights in ninja country, you should at least do your homework. Know your enemy as you know yourself, and you need not fear the outcome of 100 battles, Shino quoted. Whether your master's goal is peace or not, the way he has gone about accomplishing that goal thus far has been distinctly less than impressive. Temujin glowered at his captors. Grr, what would you know? He grumbled. Karenbana and her companions took one look at Itachi and ran for the hills. Even Rogue Ninja respected an S ranking in the bingo book, and not one of them was dumb enough to tackle someone with a reputation as fearsome as his. At the same time, Sasuke subdued the traitorous soldiers like they were merely an afterthought, needing nothing more than a split second of eye contact to drop them by the dozen. Amiya, Mikuru, and Hikaru took shelter with the circus performers and various loyal retainers inside the sunset-hued ribcage of a shadow clone Itachi's Susanoo. Okay, I think I understand what you mean by my responsibility to the country, said Mikuru weakly, his expansive gut wobbling like a gelatin mold as he crouched down next to his kind of ex-wife, trembling with a touch of fear. Yes, well. I'm just happy you're okay, Amiya mumbled, looking shell-shocked. She shuddered. Oh, that was terrifying. I thought I was going to have to watch them execute you. Hikaru hugged the neck of the huge Smilodon beneath him, a little Capuchin monkey cowering atop the beast's head. Money doesn't mean much when people are trying to kill you, Sasuke pointedly remarked, stepping over the last of the unconscious soldiers. For instance, if we were to turn on you right now, there's not a thing you'd be able to do. You paid us in advance, after all. Itachi shot his brother a mildly disapproving look. Sasuke shrugged it off. But I suppose this little coup has already shown you what happens when people place their own wealth above everything else, he continued. And I'm not really that good at lectures, anyway. More Naruto's area than mine. So let's take care of this would-be usurper already. How do you plan on doing that? Amiya wondered aloud, looking a tad mistrustful. Mikuru balked momentarily, but eventually he nodded in agreement. Those ninja are probably already warning him about you too. The palace will surely be a fortress by the time you get there. Sasuke cocked his head and looked askance at Itachi. Would you say she's underestimating our speed, there, or our skill? He dryly wondered. Civilians rarely seem to grasp just how little use high walls and iron gates are against elite shinobi, Itachi said. I suppose that ignorance helps them sleep at night, though. Let them keep their false sense of security. Do royalty technically count as civilians? Sasuke mused. They aren't combatants, reasoned Itachi. Some are, Sasuke replied. Under certain circumstances. That could be said for most people. Or have you never heard of peasants fighting in revolts? Okay, you have a point there. But I still think royalty might be a distinct classification apart from civilians. Itachi shrugged. We'll just have to look it up when we get back, he said. Well. All the more reason to wrap this up quickly. Sasuke smirked. As one, the brothers nodded and vanished in a blur of Shunshin. A quarter or so of the people inside Itachi's clone Susanoo didn't even notice. It was very cramped in there, and several lovely performers and spandex-clad acrobats took advantage of the tight quarters as an excuse to get up close and personal with the raven-haired Kage Bunshin. If they pressed any harder, it would be at risk of dispelling. Chapter 35, Science. Crescent Moon Kingdom. Timeline Beta. The past. Shit. We were not paid enough to handle this crap. Karen Bana swore to herself as she ran through the dark, dimly lit palace halls. Every shadow she passed seemed to hide a potential foe, and the glow of crimson eyes haunted the corners of her mind. Her face was pale, her blouse ripped and torn to reveal thin, shallow cuts littering her torso, and a close-shorn scalp was conspicuously bare of its accustomed wig. Fear was a constant companion for shinobi, both a blade to lay enemies low and a whetstone to make oneself ready. Fear was good, fear was useful. Fear kept you on your toes. A good ninja knew how to work with fear, how to hone themselves into a keen edge and turn that acute awareness of the threat posed by their enemy into a desperate, resourceful cunning that would reverse the situation and carry them out alive. Maybe even victorious. But it was a double edge that fear tempered, a perilous Muramasa that could slay you as easily as save you, and what Karen Bana felt right now was no constructive inkling. This was not a reasonable awareness of danger, not a shot of adrenaline to sharpen her senses and heighten her awareness. This was dread, terror, unthinking and visceral. She was not, at this moment, a hunter looking into the eyes of a tiger and steeling herself in wit and strength. It was not something she could use, not a well of strength to empower her in the last resort. She was a seasoned mercenary, a rogue ninja with countless notches on her belt. Despite a petite build and childlike stature, she had fought and defeated scores of foes in her time. She was ruthless, she was cold-blooded, she was a dagger in the night that silenced lords and generals, an icy wind from hell's depths that quenched the feeble flames of resistance. She was Kunoichi, the Reaper's scythe shrouded in a veil of silk, a pleasing form that disguised a walking instrument of death. Or so she would tell you, at least. It was admittedly difficult to unironically call yourself a seductive emissary of the cold beyond when you were built like a preteen boy, but then so often people most deeply longed for and idealized those traits which they simply did not have. The weak want to be strong, the foolish want to be smart, the lonely want to be popular, and the homely want to be handsome. So on and so forth. But that aside, Karen Bana was an experienced ninja who had undertaken 100 life-or-death missions and completed every one without fail. She was not a helpless craven who balked at the first sign of peril. She wasn't an undisciplined greenhorn who turned tail and ran the moment shit went south. Yet here she was, blindly running for her life from a foe she couldn't even be sure was actually actively pursuing her. Of course, to be fair, any ninja less than a Kage or living legend who possessed the faintest degree of sense would only fight an opponent like Itachi Uchiha if there was absolutely no other option. There were loads of loonies and psychos in the world of Rogue Ninja, and all sorts of horror stories about the biggest and baddest bastards in the underworld, but even compared to the most feared and infamous criminals out there, a ninja wiping out their own clan was nothing to sneeze at. And when that clan was, by itself, a force that could nearly rival the military of a hidden village, with centuries of history and a fearsome bloodline that could be traced back to the earliest days of shinobi history, a clan that most considered to be the elite of the elite, renowned for producing masters and prodigies with such frightening regularity that pretty much anyone bearing their family's crest was automatically marked down as a potential serious threat, well, the person who accomplished that would become the boogeyman's boogeyman. So, Regardless of whatever whispered rumors may have been in circulation about this guy apparently being pardoned and accepted back into the forces of his home village, all Karenbana knew or cared to know was that Itachi Uchiha was one of the baddest dudes around, an S-class rating in the bingo book, and a perfect 10 on the scale of dashing rogues. Not that she, paid any particular attention to that last one. Nay, perish the thought. She was a consummate professional, and she would never let herself get distracted by a pretty face while on the job. In that respect, mortal terror was quite useful. Except for when it carried her straight into a trap. Oof. Shit. Seriously, Karenbana was so worried about Itachi taking her from behind that she didn't even notice the other Uchiha kid cutting her off until he had swept her legs out from under her and jabbed the pommel of a kunai into her gut. This knocked the wind out of her lungs real effectively. Hurt like a sumbitch, too. But she still could have recovered and maybe put up a bit more of a fight, despite the pain and imbalance, if not for the hand that subsequently grasped her shoulder, and the hot breath that washed over the back of her neck. Her blood ran cold, and a leaden weight settled in her stomach. "Take care of her, will you?" said the 12-year-old who had just humiliated Karenbana, smirking and turning his back on her. "She's the only combatant left. The others are dead." Came Itachi's voice from behind her, right in her ear, terrifying and a little thrilling in its sheer proximity. "No, but they probably wish they were." Sasuke then melted into the shadows, leaving Karenbana with her captor. She probably could have made a go at escaping, then, since the only restraint was a hand on her shoulder, but by this point she'd unconsciously regressed from bolting in terror to freezing up and hoping the problem would fix itself. For a moment there was only awkward, smothering silence. It was a long moment, enough for her adrenaline to fade and leave behind a sore, tired, sweaty wreck of a woman. Weakly, Karenbana assessed her chances. She found them to be distressingly poor. "Fuck. My employer is dead, isn't he?" This was more a statement than a real question. It was, at most, a rhetorical inquiry meant to serve as a bleak observation of her circumstances, not something she posed in expectation of an answer. But this fact didn't stop Itachi from responding. "He will be shortly, if he isn't already." She felt him squeeze her shoulder. In another context, she would have assumed this to be an attempt at a comforting gesture, but here? From a killer as infamous as Itachi Uchiha? It couldn't possibly be that. "I see. And what do you plan to do with me?" she grimly wondered. Considering this guy's reputation, she'd be lucky if she just found herself stripped, beaten, tossed in a ditch and left to die. In that event there could at least be a chance of surviving and finding her way home. The worst-case scenario wasn't something she dared even consider. "I could turn you over to the authorities," Itachi said. Karenbana immediately reconsidered what she thought would be the worst possible outcome. Considering that she and her teammates were kind of technically missing Nin, well, she'd seen how her home village dealt with traitors. Flayed alive, drawn and quartered, burned at the stake, or even outright crucified. If she was hanged or beheaded, that would be a reasonably positive outcome, because at least then her death would be relatively quick and painless. And civilian magistrates would scarcely be kinder, considering that she had just fought on the losing side of a coup d'état. Even if the prince didn't make an example of her alongside her teammates, she'd probably be imprisoned and left at the mercy of his loyal soldiers. A shudder of dread and disgust went up her spine at this thought. "What if I asked you to just kill me now?" she asked bleakly. "I would not," he said. "You were simply doing the job you were paid to do. If you are put to death, then let it be only after you have been given due process and tried in accordance to the laws of the land." Karenbana turned her head to stare at Itachi, blinking owlishly. "Wow, what world do you live in?" she wondered disbelievingly. "There's no way you can't be aware that they'll just send me to the gallows the moment you turn me over." "It will be out of my hands," he said. "I have no reason to either kill you personally or let you go." For a moment, Karenbana mulled over this statement and inwardly debated the merits of one strategy over another. Against all odds, it seemed like this guy was actually bizarrely idealistic, or at least really good at lying to himself and pretending that the world was fair. At the very least, it looked like maybe he wasn't the murderous, cold-blooded psychopath all the stories made him out to be. Yes, maybe that would work. It was an option she usually scorned as undignified and pathetic, but beggars could hardly be choosers. If it could get her out of this alive, she would stoop to any level. And he was really cute for a teen. That would probably make it easier for her to swallow. Schooling her face into a seductive expression, Caranbana inched herself closer to Itachi and gave him a sample of sultry, heated bedroom eyes. Smiling coyly, she made a show of looking him up and down. So you say, but maybe I could make it worth your while to reconsider. Handsome. She winked, swallowing her pride and desperately hoping this would work. A beat. Sorry, but I'm not interested in children, Itachi bluntly answered. There was a moment of silence. A pregnant pause. Then Caranbana snapped. Hato finished his obnoxious villain rant by flicking his wrist and flinging Temujin aside with an invisible force. The old man with the awesome hat cried out in protest, and Narugui lay motionless on the floor. Elsewhere, Kiba and Akamaru were fighting the wolf girl, while Shino battled the bat girl. Naruto stood with his arms crossed at the edge of the chamber, a stony expression on his face. Temujin stared at the man who had raised him, the man whom he had unquestioningly served for so many years. He was in shock, unable to move, scarcely even able to breathe. Tears shimmered in his eyes. It was all for power, Hato declared. And what a power it is. Yes, now that the source of all Galil is within my grasp, I have no further use for you. Go, join the rest of your family in the hereafter. With a sneer, he raised his hand. The stone in the palm of Hato's glove blazed with a fey light, and Temujin saw his life flash before his eyes ere a blast of energy swallowed his field of view. An explosion rocked the chamber and brought loose stones tumbling from the ceiling. The smoke cleared, and Temujin was surprised to find himself unmarked. A sphere of black, something floated between him and Hato, no larger than an orange, wreathed in wisps of smoke and bobbing a few feet above a respectable crater. It was level with Hato's hand, and lingering sparks dancing around it betrayed that this orb had just taken the blast meant for Temujin. Hato stared, perplexed. Temujin gaped, trying to figure out what had just happened. Naruto took a step forward, and his footfall was a deafening booming noise that echoed through the mine. His face was unreadable save for his eyes, which were a cold and steely blue. Some massive presence bore down on everyone in the room, and the Galil overhead started to crack. The truth-seeking orb unraveled, and the stone in Hato's glove exploded into 100 glittering shards. Thank you for that, Naruto said to Hato, cracking his knuckles. Really, thank you. It's been a very long time since I've fought an enemy who was such a genuinely irredeemable piece of shit. But now I can go all out without feeling guilty. He clenched his fist, and his chakra flared to life like an explosion. Following the example of Hato's glove, the Galil in the mines rang, quivered, trembled, and shattered in catastrophic resonance with an even greater power, showering the chamber in glittering stardust. Holy Mother of... breathed Temujin, staring awestruck as he crossed himself. What the? Hato gasped, his monocle popping out. You're a disgrace to good leaders everywhere, taking advantage of lost and misguided kids to further your own selfish ambitions, Naruto growled. You make people like Danzo and Orochimaru seem downright reasonable, because they at least talk about having goals larger than themselves. But you? No, you're just a selfish, greedy son of a bitch who wants power for power's sake, and will do anything it takes to get it. You make me sick. Naruto's eyes flashed, and he willed a Rasengan into life. It sucked in the airborne particles of Galil, drawing on the fantastic energy in every mote of dust, swelling rapidly in size and gaining an otherworldly glow as it took on the nature of all things. The shards of Galil drew into alignment around the makeshift chakra singularity, orbiting it like stars in the arms of a galaxy. Temujin scooped up Narugui and ran over to the old man behind Naruto, being in possession of sufficient sense to realize that he did not want to get in the blonde's way right now. Hato, resting squarely at the other end of the spectrum in regards to not being an idiot, dumbly stared at the cosmic raisin shuriken and tried to wrap his head around the fact that the very power he had sought was now being focused into an attack aimed squarely at him. Wah! What is this impudence? He shrieked in furious indignation, frothing and livid. How dare you? You have no right to this. After everything I've sacrificed to get here. Damn you! Who do you think you are, boy? Naruto scoffed and looked Hato straight in the eye, holding a giant, galaxy-shaped raisin shuriken that glowed with an emerald green energy. Who the hell do you think I am? He replied. Bounding forward in the blink of an eye, Naruto whipped the Giga raisin shuriken at Hato. It caught him square in the gut and carried him off the floor, swerving upward at Naruto's command and piercing through the earth. This attack rose above the heavens, a buzzsaw of unbridled power lifting Hato into orbit. Idly, Naruto hoped it didn't hit the moon when it detonated. That would be really hard to explain. The graceful lioness pounced, and the mighty mother bear struck. Sakura rammed her fist through the chakra-absorbing crystal, smashing it into pieces, and Hinata jabbed digital fangs into the armor's bared inner workings, rapid finger strikes shutting down the flow of energy through it. Their opponent didn't even get a chance to react, and Doto's expression during this was priceless. First there was the moment of confusion, then the shock as he realized what had just happened, and finally the dawning look of fear. He saw them cock their arms back in unison, and take one menacing step forward. Like a hissing noise coming from a paper tag, he instinctively grasped the imminent danger betrayed by their stances. It was as obvious as a fist inches from your face. Oh, she! Simultaneously, faster than lightning, the two girls struck him in the gut. Doto was launched straight through the air, catapulted backwards by their combined blow, and he crashed with a massive boom into one of the iced-over pylons, where a thick frost covering shattered from the force of his body's impact. Miraculously, the devices activated, and the reveal of their true nature was a very beautiful and striking scene with all the packed snow, glacial ice, and permafrost quickly vanishing to expose a perfectly green and vibrant meadow, rather than a filthy, slushy, muddy hellhole of a mess. There was a moment of respectful silence for the death of the generic villain, while those present stared in awe and wonder at the compelling, provocative imagery of. Wow, Hinata said, looking at the melting snow and ice. This can't be good for the environment. It really isn't, Sakura said. Just think of all the flash floods from melted snow, or what the warmer temperatures here will do to the continent's weather systems. I mean, thank goodness it's only temporary, but still. Koyuki-san's father really wasn't a very prudent ruler, was he? Hinata whispered, looking sidelong at the princess in question. Spending a fortune on developing weapons, or just stashing away a huge cache of treasure, probably would have been a better investment for his country. I know, right? Sakura said with a grimace. Talk about horrifically short-sighted. Koyuki chose this moment to frown and glance in the girl's direction, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. Hinata and Sakura immediately looked the other way and started innocently whistling. Koyuki pursed her lips and sniffed. And then, after we'd tied up all the loose ends and attended her inauguration, I handed Koyuki-san a list of suggestions for her next movie. Hinata set down her cup of tea and gestured vaguely, a sweet smile hardly belying the implications of her statement. Naruto nodded and Sasuke hummed. Sakura sniggered and waggled her eyebrows suggestively. You forgot to mention the kisses she gave us as thanks. The pinkette quipped, elbowing Hinata in the ribs. That was an especially nice bonus. Naruto whistled and Sasuke stared. She kissed you? They said, one sounding interested while the other sounded disbelieving. Yeah, Sakura said. Now I know what it feels like to be the Prince Charming in a fairy tale. Hee. Loads better than being the princess. I don't know. I still think I'd rather wait in the tower than fight the dragon, Hinata said with a laugh. And there's something to be said about seeing the man of your dreams climb atop his vanquished foe, his clothes tattered from an epic battle, his skin glistening from sweat and smeared with blood, his muscles bulging as he wraps you up in his arms and, red heart. Naruto grinned rakishly while Sasuke rolled his eyes. Sakura chortled. Yes. But enough about us. How'd your mission go, dear? She asked Sasuke. He shrugged. It was a success, he said. We protected the prince and his convoy, and I assassinated a would-be usurper. Also, Itachi might have started some kind of relationship with an enemy Kunoichi, I'm not completely certain. What a heartbreaker, Naruto deadpanned. Did he get any of her numbers? We're pre-telephones, idiot. Or did you forget? No, I mean. Naruto waved a hand and traced an hourglass in the air. You know, her numbers. Vitals. Measurements. Height, weight, birthday, hair color, eye color, blood type, sign. Lower, conspiratorially, he added, bust, waist, hips. You know, that kinda thing. Sasuke snorted. What does it matter? He asked. It's for research, Naruto said. I've been cataloging all known Uchiha and their love interests to see if there are any features in common. We need inspiration, pal. Why don't you just do like Jiraiya and peep on women in the hot springs? It's less annoying that way, Sasuke retorted. Then he paused, looking perturbed. Oh, wow. Can't believe I just said that. Neither can I, Naruto said. You know that's Hinata's job. The Hyuga clan already knows what everyone looks like naked. Sakura chuckled, and Hinata smiled slyly. Coughing and faintly blushing, Sasuke shifted in his seat. Gee, thanks for the reminder, he sarcastically muttered. But you'd have to ask Itachi for the details. He was reticent and didn't say much. You know, the way gentlemen are. He gave the others a pointed look. Wait, was it that girl who looked like a kid? Sakura interjected, frowning thoughtfully. Huh, I didn't know Itachi was into that, looks like I'll have to watch out that I don't enflame his lusts, dear. Naruto laughed, and Hinata giggled at the joke, while Sasuke rolled his eyes. She was petite. Let's leave it at that, all right. He said. I'm having a hard enough time getting the image out of my head without you guys constantly prompting me for details. I saw things that I had no desire to ever see. Oh. His Rinnegan was on the whole time, wasn't it? Said Hinata, expression turning a touch sympathetic. Damn that shared field of vision, Sasuke grumbled, answer enough for the discussion's purpose. Hinata nodded softly in understanding. I understand. If it's any consolation, in my own family it's nearly an unspoken rite of passage to accidentally see family members in the middle of intimate discussions, she told him. Some things can never be unseen, so we just have to live with the mental images. She patted him comfortingly on the shoulder, sending a meaningful look to her husband. Right, Naruto said, catching her cue to change the topic. Well, as far as my own mission, I think it went pretty well. Shino and Kiba did great against their opponents. Relatedly, Shino is pants-shittingly terrifying. He shuddered theatrically. You don't really appreciate just how many orifices the average human body has until you've seen swarms of flesh-eating beetles pouring out of every single one. If Kurama hadn't been there to take my mind off of the absolute, unrelenting horror of the spectacle, I'd probably be a wordlessly gibbering wreck right about now. He raised his hands in a shrug and grinned, ending this observation on a morbidly joking note. Sasuke and Sakura snorted. What, you aren't already? The former said dryly. Meh. I've seen creepier, said Sakura at the same time, seeming nonchalant. What, seriously? The others all gave her skeptical looks. Pro tip? Never look at Shizune-san's internet history. A haunted smile adorned Sakura's lips, and her eyes were hollow shadows. You will be scarred for life. I am not even joking. Naruto scratched his chin thoughtfully. Huh. That explains so much, and yet so little. Our life stories in a nutshell. Makeshift laboratory. Timeline Gamma. The future. Adjusting coordinates to 00.914 along the delta blue axis. Prepare to fire tracer. Tracer charged. Particle density optimal. Holding fire. Chrome plating gleamed on an object best described as an blooming sphere, glowing pulses of energy traveling along the dark ley lines of an obscenely complex seal formula etched into the metal. Minuscule, crystalline wafers no wider than the finest hairs leaned infinitesimally this way and that as hands alight with chakra molded a holographic input. Smaller than a grapefruit, this device looked like something straight out of science fiction, and its presence seemed to dominate the room in a subtle, almost indescribable way. Off to one side, Boruto Uzumaki flipped a switch on a far cruder-looking device, a mess of wires and circuits that seemed to have been soldered together in a mad rush. An LCD monitor flickered briefly, before flashing a string of numbers and formulaic symbols that would have looked like complete gibberish to 99% of humanity. Humming, the blonde tapped out a staccato beat on a nearby keyboard. A huddle of PCs jury-rigged into a cyclopean behemoth of processing power hummed and whirred, radiating significant amounts of heat noticeable even with the air conditioners clinking and roaring in every window, blasting cold air into the room. Detecting feedback echoes. Local receivers primed for temporal influx. Surge protectors in order. Understood, said Sarada Uchiha. Firing tracer. The device on the center table brightened slightly, then dimmed. It was strangely serene and understated, little more than a noiseless blip amidst the cacophonous buzzing and thrumming of the surrounding instruments. Sarada's glasses seemed opaque in the machine's glow, reflecting the light from its acid-etched Fuinjutsu circuitry. A moment later, her eyes were visible. They were baggy and a tad bloodshot, but her expression was still one of utmost concentration and alertness. 3 Sherinon stared unblinkingly into space, as though hoping to read the secrets of reality swirling in the nebulous ether. A bank of monitors lining one wall flashed various readings and calculations, displaying a flood of raw data that had started coming in before the tracer, a subatomic probe made of clustered elementary particles first observed, documented, and named by her boyfriend, was even fired. This was one of those small details that really drove home the surreality of their present work. Do we see any causal deviations in Delta Blue 00.914? She queried in a dry, clipped tone. Nothing significant, Boruto replied, clicking his tongue. Space-time at those coordinates appears to react normally to tachyon scattering. It's a classic 4-dimensional ripple pattern with 0 hints of turbulence. I see. And you're cataloging the results anyways, I assume. Wouldn't be much of a scientist if I didn't. Not that you are a scientist in any official capacity. Science ninja, scientist. Boruto said. They're basically the same thing. That's not what Shiho-san says. Bah, what does she know? Cryptanalysis is just a glorified number game. No experiments, no discovery, nothing genuinely new. Just making more complicated patterns from the same basic elements. Sarada laughed. That sounds like all science in a nutshell, to me. But then I'd much rather be out in the field, on a mission, than doing any of these things. Boruto looked across between peevish and sheepish. Philistines, he grumbled. I'm totally unappreciated in my time. To be fair, Uzumaki-on is kind of a silly name for a subatomic particle. I discovered them. Boruto said defensively. I should get to name them. And it's not like the name's irrelevant, anyways. Yeah, you discovered them while studying the properties of Aunt Karen's sealing chains. We all know the story, Mr. Ragin Bolt. Boruto blushed. That was just a phase, he mumbled. It's sewn onto the inside of your forehead protector. He went quiet, face beet red. For several moments he said nothing while his girlfriend's smirk grew steadily wider. Then he cleared his throat and flipped another switch, typing a command into their makeshift supercomputer. Adjusting coordinates to 00.915 along the Delta Blue axis, he said after a minute of awkward silence. Prepare to fire the tracer, okay? Got it, Sarada said, still smiling. Channeling a bit of chakra through the holographic input on the very fancy and expensive-looking instrument in the center of the room, she said, tracer charged. Particle density optimal. Holding fire. Feedback from the next shot is starting to come in, Bolt said, regaining more of his professionalism as they resumed the Zen tedium of experimentation. Backups stored, receivers primed. Surge protectors in order. Understood. Sarada nodded. Firing tracer. Once more, the device infinitesimally brightened for a second or two before returning to its standard luminescence. Data scrawled across the monitors. Anything here? Sarada asked. Tracer impact reveals slight causal turbulence in sector Delta Blue 00.915. Marking these coordinates as a possible location. Oh. How many of those do we have so far? Somewhere in the range of 392,000, last I checked. Sarada hissed. Fuck. This is going to take us forever. On the bright side, I think I've almost perfected unifying field theory, Naruto said offhandedly with a lopsided smile. Mapping the geometry of space-time in the infinite multiverse really gives you some excellent perspective on the fundamental nature of reality. Sarada gave a wry grin at this. Heh, I love it when you talk nerdy to me, she joked. Naruto laughed. That's it for part 12. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.